sustainable cities and communities. I'm Lucia Pedrana, and today, together with Adi Halaj, we're going to host the third edition of the forum here in Chicago. For those who don't know us, the European Cultural Center organizes exhibitions, symposiums, workshops, educational programs, and cultural events in the field of contemporary art, architecture, and design. All exhibitions and events are open and free entrance for everyone. Following the two previous editions of which took place at the ECC Italy in Venice, we are grateful to our partner, the Chicago Architecture Biennial, for the hospitality in this beautiful location. For the public here in Millennium Park rooms, we kindly ask you to keep your masks on, and coffee is available next door. And if you need anything, just please ask ECC or CAP staff. For the audience following us through our YouTube channel, we invite them to share their questions on the chat, and they will be brought to the floor here at the end of the panel conversations.
Thank you, Lucia. So we are thrilled to be here. We are very happy to take Shaping the City outside of home, outside of Venice, and bring it to a new setting, a new context here in Chicago. Well, now would wonder, why in Chicago? Why are we coming here? Well, needless to say, if you just look on your right and you see the Millennium Park, the Chicago skyline, punctuated with this beautiful architecture, the bold architecture, the history, the renowned museums, and of course, the unique urban planning. So for that, the forum recognizes the significant role that architecture, urban planning, and design all play in molding the interaction with people, the cities, and our well-being. So the importance of such forums is to bring the challenges and urgencies of our time to the table, and Shaping the City aims to evoke these new ideas and set the ground for discussions, sharing of knowledge, and dissemination to a very broad audience.
But before diving into the program of today, let's have a look at a short video teaser about the second edition of Shaping the City, which took place in Venice on October 15 and 16. So this is just an anticipation of a longer video that is soon going to be available on ECC and Shaping the City social media. You had the chance to see some familiar faces. We had Edson Copperfield and Robert Shibley from the 2018 edition that we are super happy to have back to this edition of the forum. We had Allen Sayeg and Javier Arpa Fernandez and many others that they were also in Venice in October. But we are, of course, super happy also to have new faces and to create an interesting dialogue between the local experience in Chicago and what we bring with ECC. What Shaping the City really means is and aims is to bring together academics, practitioners, planners, designers, and policymakers into one conversation. So we are very happy to have you all here.
Lucia, that being said, Shaping the City really establishes these connections and conversations that wouldn't have been possible without getting into one place altogether and discussing issues that shape the lives of people and our cities. So this edition in particular, the presentations and panel discussions confront the fundamental topics that set forward new thoughts around the rights to the city through spatial, pragmatic, and inclusive sustainable approaches. It dives into the theme of this year's Chicago Architecture Biennial, the available city, which will be highlighted and presented by the artistic director of this biennial, David Brown. And this edition in 2021 Chicago tackles these themes by comparing completely different approaches in international cities and looking into two panels, architecture for the people and reimagining the city. So I think we've said enough. I think it's time to start. Chia?
Let's start. To open the conversation of today, we have a keynote speech by the artistic director of the 2021 Chicago Architecture Biennial, David Brown. So let me introduce David. David is a Chicago-based designer, researcher, and educator. His work investigates flexible and variable approaches to urban design within the available city, an ongoing speculation on the potential of Chicago City's own vacant land. David's work has been exhibited in the Venice Architecture Biennial, the Chicago Cultural Centers Expo 72, the Chicago Architecture Biennial, and received a grant from the Graham Foundation in 2011. Brown has lectured at Columbia University, at Politecnico in Milano, and has taught at Florida A&M University and Rice University. He is currently a professor in the School of Architecture at the University of Illinois at Chicago, UIC. Following David's speech, we are going to have a conversation between David and Javier Arpa Fernandez. So, David, the floor is yours. You can get this. You need to switch it on? Yeah, and if you need, you have a clicker.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Adi and Lucia. Oh, thank you, Adi and Lucia. Sorry, I have a microphone and I wasn't using it. I'll try to remember to. And thank you all for coming out today. So I am going to talk about the available city, and if we can go ahead and pull up the presentation. Or am I just talking off the top of my head?
No.
Oh, okay, all right. I can do both, but the images help me remember what I should talk about in any one moment. Just while we're waiting, so this is a project. It's been an honor to be asked to be the artistic director. This is a project that I've been working on for some time, and as I will allude to, I think it's a combination of really having been continuing to work on it and refine it over time. And at the same time, I think given the past year, that it's something that it had a kind of moment where it seemed appropriate as a biennial, that it would have been hard to, I think at the time when the biennial was being planned, nobody was imagining that we would be able to sit here in the cultural center today. And so the fact that it is something that's concentrating on outdoor spaces is, I think, one of the reasons why I was asked to do it. And can we go all the way back? This is the last slide. Can we go all the way to the top? Oh, thank you. I was thinking this is a... So which way do I do this? Sorry.
On the white, and then you point down there.
Okay. All right, thank you. So I did go ahead and, let me just, I won't look like I wear a mask the whole time. I did go ahead and title this as a combination. I think the project is looking at both, I will say, the architecture for the people, and at the same time it is about reimagining the city. And I think it does that in terms of looking at the city-owned land and really starting to understand the city-owned land as one larger landscape. So as you can see here, I need to hold on to this. It is a map Part of what I have done, or really started with this project back in 2009, and then starting to refine, was looking at the map of the city-owned vacant lots. And so really using the city's database of their land inventory. This is something that's online now. At the time it was a paper document, but really trying to understand where the land was and kind of get a sense of its size and quantity. And so in doing the mapping and working with students to actually begin to draw this out, we also started to identify that there was as much vacant land that was privately held as there was city land. And so the city land at the time was about 15,000. It goes up and down, so I currently just say 10,000 plus. But that land is primarily on the south and west sides, and if we assume that it is a standard lot in the US, and sorry I won't have a metric conversion, is 25 feet by 125 feet. And so if you assume that each lot is that size, that you get something that's about the size of the Loop or the downtown area here. And that the private land pretty much matched that. And so there's a territory that's actually about twice the size of the Loop, that's primarily concentrated on the south and west sides. And then 70% of that as well is in about 18 south and west side neighborhoods. And so really starting to think through what's the possibility for that land in relationship to those neighborhoods and in relationship to those communities. Those have been historically, since on the south side, I think starting with the Great Migration, so a little bit more in the early or mid-teens and 20s. I'm going to be a little imprecise in the dates, and then a little bit more starting in the 50s on the west side. Have primarily been black and brown neighborhoods. And then in a way, the vacant land is an indicator of what's been some of the disinvestment that's taken place, or a lot of the disinvestment that's taken place over time. And so this edition of the biennial is actually looking at the idea of the available city in terms of really saying that all of that city-owned land could be the basis for collective spaces that would be informed by the interests and needs of neighborhoods. And that's through working with community organizations in those neighborhoods. There is also in relationship to the private land, a way in which there could be collective space that's using combinations of city and private land and recognizing the city land as a form of easement relative to collective space. And so this biennial edition is focused on spaces out in neighborhoods that were actually developed with community organizations in those neighborhoods. The ones in green are really the biennial sites. That includes the Graham Foundation and the space in the Cultural Center here. That's, I guess, at the northeast end on the first floor. But in a way, I would say, from a standpoint of biennials that have been here in the past, I would say about 90 to 95% of those past biennials took place in this building in terms of utilizing all of the spaces. In this one, I'm kind of saying that we're maybe in about 5% of this building, I think probably less, and that 90 to 95% of the biennial is actually out distributed within those neighborhoods in terms of spaces. And so what I'm going to do now quickly is we're going to move, or fairly quickly move from the west side east and then south to look quickly at all of the sites. I have decided to primarily highlight the projects in use rather than, I think, a lot of the photos that have been shown have really been talking about the spaces themselves, but not necessarily during a lot of the activities and events. Oops. Oh, and before I do that, so yes, this project was first exhibited in 2012 in the Venice Architecture Biennale by David Chipperfield. that was titled Common Ground. And it was one of 5 projects. It was an exhibit organized by Alexander Eisenschmidt, and 4 of us. He did something that was looking at the imaginary Chicago, so projections of towers for the Loop and other projects that had been done over the century. And then also in combination work by Stanley Tigerman on the left. The model to the right is for the available city, urban labs, growing water, and then Studio Gang looking a little bit more at a series of projects along the coast of both the river and the lake. And so really thinking of those as kind of one city. And then for the 2015 biennial, the project really became the focus for 9 other contributors. And so Eker Gill, in a sub-exhibit of the 2015 inaugural Chicago Architecture Biennial, organized Bold, which was focused on projects in Chicago. He asked that I exhibit the work and that we invited 9 other firms in the city to begin to respond to the ideas of the available city, in that instance concentrating primarily on buildings. So in a way, projects that would be using combinations of city and private land. And then the current biennial is really focused on spaces. Sorry, I will get this. In preceding that in 2019, so following 2015, I started to try to work with community organizations to realize spaces. That was looking primarily in North Lawndale, a neighborhood I had worked with, done an exhibit on back in 2006, and so had some relationships with different organizations and individuals there. So I started to talk about the ideas of the available city. 2 organizations, CCA Academy, which is one of the participants in the biennial, and MLK District Garden showed interest. And so I was working with them to try to proceed and go for grants to begin to realize spaces. In 2019, applied to the Chicago Architecture Biennial for partner programming. And so I was able to organize a set of youth studios for CCA Academy and some workshops for MLK District Garden. So what you see here is really the youth studios organized by Antonio Torres of Bittertang, working with students at CCA and some students from UIC to really think about ideas for a platform and canopy. That would be within CCA Academy's Perma Park. Quickly, I will say, I think in essence, the model that I introduced there in terms of community organizations, letting them define the project. So in essence, CCA Academy was asking for an outdoor classroom within their permaculture garden, which they had started in 2017. And they were really thinking of that space, they wanted that space to be an active part of the garden. So not necessarily a pavilion, an architectural element that sat in distinction to the garden, but was an active part of the life of the garden in terms of elements growing upon it. And so to me, or part of the permaculture system. And so to me, that brought to mind Bittertang's work in terms of a group that incorporates nature in terms of both kind of forms and processes. And so that's how I decided upon that pairing. And that's really been the process throughout the biennial. And so this is some of the work that was developed. And I will say, I think this is the other aspect that I think led to my being asked to be artistic director, was that while I'm talking about all of the city-owned land and began to organize these partnerships, I haven't actively been pursuing designing the sites themselves. It is this aspect of looking to understand what the organization is looking to do and beginning to think about who is a designer that would begin to bring an interesting insight relative to what they're doing, and in a way through what they might design actually begin to exceed the expectations of what that group is thinking about. So addressing their interests and needs, but also in ways that are unanticipated. And so I think it's that aspect of my talking about a lot of sites, but at the same time not wanting to be the designer of all the sites and really facilitating relationships between organizations and designers, and thinking about that in terms of what's the exchange and how do they begin to complement one another is really vital to the project. And vital to, I think, why I was asked to be the artistic director in terms of having multiple individuals involved. And so, two, I think one of the things that's odd about the project in this moment is, and beneficial about the pandemic, is that we all globally learned how to video conference, and so could really take advantage of, before I was working a little bit more with local architects, but really being able to say, and true to the biennial, that we could begin to engage community organizations with different firms around the world, and that those groups were in conversation, in some cases weekly, in other cases every 2 weeks, or maybe monthly here and there. But that there really was a kind of immersive exchange that was taking place in terms of discussion of ideas, review of ideas, and how the projects begin to develop. And I think that exchange is important as well, that it's not just about what's being designed, but to me, from the community standpoint, I think how does that begin to open the imagination to have individuals from around the world really beginning to talk with them about what's possible in their neighborhood. And then at the same time, I think beneficial for designers in terms of really gaining insights in terms of different communities around the world. So to begin to go through these, and I'm going to do it fairly quickly. For Wyman, cycle can or bike box, that's the red shipping container that you see here. This is on Pulaski out on the west side in North Lawndale. They have introduced bike repair and rental. They were also starting to introduce outside of that space on the other side a set of raised bed gardens. That was primarily growing a pepper that's the basis for a hot sauce. And so I asked Saku Cook to work with them in part in terms of expanding the kind of collection of shipping containers that organize the space, but in this case, really thinking about a shipping container cut into parts, and that the parts really begin to pick up on all of the aspects of what Wyman had already introduced, but at the same time expand a little bit the possibilities. So as cut, there are spaces for just sitting and gathering, some spaces in which there can be a small marketplace, and then some spaces that are raised beds as well, and then one small space that's also additional bicycle storage. Soil Lab is a Danish Arts Foundation contribution. This is the second partnership with between the Danish Arts Foundation and the Chicago Cultural Center, Chicago Architecture Biennial. Last time they did something out in Garfield Park that was in the outdoor space, and so this time really there was a competition for something in a neighborhood. Soil Lab won the competition, which was to really on a site, have a site of production in terms of working with soil to make brick, and really the site itself is a demonstration of possibilities, having combination of brick at the base, rammed earth, and then they were also beginning to then actively work with with residents in the assembly of the Ramdurf elements, and then work with and have an active brick production space on site, and how that production actually begins to spread knowledge into the neighborhood, but then also how that activity begins to be a gathering space as well, or gathering form as well. Oops, can you go back one? Sorry, I don't know if I have the ability to do that. What's that? Okay, thank you. Oh, and then this is the project by Bittertang as it developed over time, which really begins to pick up on a lot of the forms of permapark. There's a set of Hugo culture elements. There are rock elements, and then fruit trees are really the primary planting. And so really looking to use all of those, to think about all of those elements and begin to propose a set of totems that are also the basis for mycelium and potentially bird nests, some woven willow structures in which things can grow, and at the same time beginning to form this kind of inner space that could be the site for a gathering or discussion, or as you can see here, that you could also begin to sit with an activity could take place at the center, and then in the periphery could be more of the gathering space. And so this is something that's also an active part of the garden. The director for CCA, she remarked that this is a space that they would have realized on their own eventually, but they would have made something that's a lot more functional. And so I think really enjoyed this collaboration in terms of numerous individuals have remarked that you're really right adjacent to a major street, a major kind of light industrial corridor, and so heavily trafficked. But when you're standing in the space, you actually no longer think about the fact that you're on Pulaski, and so feel transported in some ways. The next space is a hard surface play lot called Bell Park. It is a site for a basketball court. Oops, and I jumped another one again. So it is the site for a basketball court. I invited Outpost Office to do a kind of painting relative to some workshops that had been done before, working with youth. In terms of really, and Outpost has started to do these drawings with GPS-guided robot that's typically used for painting sports fields. To begin to explore how that could actually begin to organize other spaces. They did this just north of here for a foundation in terms of an outdoor space. And so I thought it was a good opportunity to begin to explore with WACA, West Side Association for Collective Action, how the space could be utilized in addition to basketball through a painted surface, and in a way through the painted surface because they are thinking about resurfacing this court at some time in the future, and so not necessarily thinking about this as something that could be permanent, but an opportunity to think about and test out possibilities. So the design in some ways responds to some patterns of how residents are actively moving around and through this space, but then at the same time responding to the court, looking to begin to set up other opportunities and suggestions of how individuals and groups might gather. And so begins to be both a kind of backdrop that is maybe just something that is referenced tangentially or is actually the basis for other activities. On that same site by Studio Barnes is something he's termed the bounce house, or Jermaine Barnes termed the bounce house. It is a hard play pavilion in contrast to a bounce inflatable structure that one would bounce inside of. But I think really trying to, in a way, create this element that could be used by youth and adults in terms of youth climbing on it and peering through. But I think also, as you can see here, space that you can also just begin to gather around. And then in a way, this is meant to recall block parties as an activity. And so an activity that's vital in neighborhoods in terms of really being a basis for neighborhood gatherings, and so tend to take place right before the start of the school year. And so looking to, in some ways, also create this structure that has this kind of different view portals that children might explore. And then Central Park Theater is actually, there's a group that's looking to renovate the space. This is a multi-year project, and it's something that's more about the interior, but really looking to, they were interested in how they might activate their parking lot in terms of calling attention to the fundraising effort, and also talking about the history of the theater. And I asked Manuel Hers to work with them. In part, I think just responding to and appreciating this kind of aspect of a group that's trying to work on the interior, but thinking about that through activity on the exterior. And I think, and so to me, in some of Manuel Herz's work, I think this ability to talk about these kind of conditions that maybe are long in time. So he's also worked for a long period with a refugee camp that's effectively a permanent city at this point. And so in this case, I think, too, really beginning to think about the history of the theater, and I think, again, this effort to begin to talk about what's happening in the interior. I am trying to organize between the two another workshop that will now start to think about the interior and potentially help contribute to some of the fundraising that will be needed for this project, but at the same time, how they might realize some greater utilization of the interior, even as that renovation is being planned and projected. This is the South Bank. I should have Lauren present this one. She can probably do a better job than me. But this is at South Bank Park. So in South Loop, Lend-Lease has introduced a park along the riverfront. That riverfront had really been the location for a lot of the freight and coming in and out in terms of trains, and then also passengers trains. And so through a set of frame elements, Port was really working, and Port to me often looks to talk about, especially in Chicago, and they're partially based here, talk about the history of Chicago and the history of the river and landscape within their work. And so in this case, I think through the small frame elements, looking to recall some of the sensibilities of the larger frame structure that used to sit on this site, and so bring to mind a little bit of the different history and occupancies that have occurred, and then at the same time, how that can be organized into a space that can host just individuals gathering within each one of these small frame elements, but then at the same time, there could be something that takes place at the center and organizes a larger gathering. The next one is El Paseo Garden, which is a large community garden. It's large enough where I actually think of it as a garden of gardens. So they have beekeeping, they have raised individual plots, they have a kind of larger anyone can harvest garden, and then they host various activities. And so within some of their spaces, they were looking at both how to, in a larger space, a drawing by Outpost Office that in this case didn't last for long because of rain, but really thinking about how they would use a larger open space, but then also really wanting to increase opportunities for seating. and so I asked Studio Osadiana to begin to work with them. I think in part really appreciating within their work how they have these elements that can be combinations of play as well as seating, and in this case, these are really a series of block elements that form one large table. I think of the table itself as its own kind of micro garden. In terms of, you can see that there's some things that are actively planted on it. There's a series of games children can climb over and under and around and through. And there's a grilling station. So in a way, a space that sits more or less within the middle of the garden, especially as that garden will expand. That can be a hub of activity of its own, or at the same time, excuse me, a secondary activity in terms of a more casual area while some larger event is taking place somewhere else. Atelier Bow Wow was paired with Grow Greater Inglewood, which had really just acquired a very large site adjacent to a raised rail bed, and that is for ultimately a plaza that's a demonstration garden relative to Grow Greater Inglewood, and then at the same time, they have an ambition of creating what you see in the image to your left, a larger platform in which they can host a farmer's market, but then also begin to have other activities such as performances or showing films. And so working with Atelier Bow Wow, I think both from this idea of a kind of commons with that Atelier Bow Wow is interested in, but in a way too, Grow Greater Inglewood was really interested in kind of how this might be a woods construction, and I think I just appreciated Atelier Bow Wow's sensibilities and thought they would be a good pairing. And so what was built is really an edge element, which is more of a large table underneath a kind of frame of lighting, and there will be a canopy as well. But then ultimately, hopefully this summer, but I think Grow Greater Inglewood and the Biennial are really trying to continue to pursue how this can get implemented in terms of the larger boardwalk surface. This site had some challenges. It's on a raised, there's 18 inches of wood chips, and so a lot of questions about what was below the ground, and so it's a little slower process than I think everyone initially anticipated, but I think everyone is interested in seeing its fuller realization. The long table itself, I think in this case, has multiple uses, both in terms of you can still organize events on the wood chips and project out from that table in terms of where a group might locate. The table can also be used for a meal. It can be used for gatherings or harvesting from the demonstration garden and talking about how to grow food and what to do with food after you've harvested. And then to try to get through. Project Hood, this is a church group that has acquired a site. Currently, the Reverend who acquired the site is reenacting how he acquired it, which previously here there was a motel. He sat on that, he camped on that motel from, I guess, Thanksgiving, so around late November into mid-February or late February. So in the coldest part of the year, and with an insistence of wanting to fundraise and buy the site. It is now cleared and projected to be a community center. And so through what you see here, really anticipating trying to imagine what the community center could be in terms of performance space, and then also an exhibit space, another painted court. And so they've hosted activities. In here you can see on opening day, the Reverend reenacted kind of being on the rooftop. And they're really, the activity is talking about the history of the site. And then they're also continuing to gather information about Woodlawn and how the space might be utilized. The open workshop at Overton School, this is one of two projects based there. Overton School is a site that's been used, this is the second time it's been utilized relative to the biennial. And so here, a set of open workshop was projecting an outdoor meeting space and really thinking of that as a larger distributed commons. And so an active space that can take place here through curtains. It can have different scales. That's matched by a project by Borderless Studio that has really been working on this site for multiple years. But they were introducing a market space. That the idea of that market space developed first through just the activity of a market, and then looking to become more formalized over time. They also introduced raised beds. And to me, these two were in discussion about the relationship that could take place between, or this, in some ways, in one's using fabric and curtains in the vertical, the other one in the horizontal. And so the interplay between those two. The last two are, in some ways, I think, I would say projects that are kind of organization seeking. These were two that were invited, Matriarchy on your left and Hood Design Studio on the right. I think they had interesting ideas in terms of the space by Matriarchy is really a seating space, but also trying to talk about intersectionality in terms of a space to just sit and reflect, but then at the same time, there are some QR codes on these poles that would begin to connect you to a narrative about connecting our global South Side, so really trying to talk about spaces in the South Side and how a Black community begins to form collective space, but then drawing parallels to spaces in cities in Africa. And then Walter Hood is looking at an idea of witness trees. This is informed a little bit by thinking about the trees on the Washington Mall in terms of how they've been witness to the history there. And then in this case, looking to recreate the Great Migration. These are southern cypress trees, and so have traveled in, as a species from Mississippi to Chicago. And they're planted here, and then both have, again, these kind of details. So here's just the reflective surface. There's QR codes. In the case of Hood Design, there's really also these ornaments where residents can leave remembrances. And so in these ways, over the course of the biennial, the trees gain history. And then he is thinking about that these trees could be subsequently planted as a group or individually by an organization in Woodlawn, or not initially in Woodlawn, but nearby, and or that residents can take them. And I think the same, the structures by Matriarchy, we are trying to think about where could they go. They're currently in a city site, but where they might go in terms of as a group and or distributed across different spaces and organizations in North Lawndale. Connecting that to the city, I will say in closing that to me, the biennial starts what I have projected as a process in terms of there really being, these are a set of spaces. Some of them will continue beyond the biennial, or the majority of them in some respects will continue beyond the biennial. They also help those organizations really begin to advance their work across potentially other sites. So Grow Greater Inglewood, for instance, is looking at what can be a set of sites and the eventual transformation of the raised bed into a walking path. And to me, there can be a continued cycle of from the sites here, workshops to begin to talk about what can be other possible spaces, the realization of those spaces in time. And so in a way, over time, one would begin to get the larger field or larger territory of collective space on city-owned vacant lots, adding up to this much larger landscape. And that is really how the available city has always been projected. And so in a way, the biennial to me is a starting point just as much as it is an exhibition for this particular edition. Thank you.
Where do I stand here?
Sorry, maybe.
No, I stand next to you. Well, thank you very much, David, for taking us on this virtual tour through the Chicago Architecture Biennial. Yesterday, we had the chance with the ACC team and with Javier, who's going to join us shortly, to have a tour in different places. And yeah, it was very, very interesting. I invite you all to go and check it out if you have some time. So let me introduce Javier Arpa Fernandez, who's going to join us in a conversation with David right now. So Javier is an architecture and urbanism teacher, researcher, author, and curator. He completed his master's degree in architecture at TU Delft. He specializes in the dissemination of architectural and urbanism practice. He is the research and education coordinator at the Y Factory, a global think tank and research institute at TU Delft, which is directed by Winnie Maas. He also holds the position of lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the curator of the public programs at the Faculty of Architecture of TU Delft and the editor-in-chief of the architecture firm MVRDV. So Javier, please everyone help me welcome Javier, who's gonna have a conversation with David.
Thank you very much. Hello. Hi. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Hari, for the introduction and the presentation. But I would like to, besides thanking ECC for letting me be here, I think it's the morning for David. So thank you, David, for the work that you have presented. Not only for the work that you have presented, I would say for the work that you have done. First of all, one of the first things that came to my mind this morning is like, why are not we in some of these sites in Chicago? I know it's cold outside, but I just felt like going to one of these places and talk about the biennial in one of the places where the biennial is actually happening. We have a little time, I think, but I would like to talk to you about two things. Maybe first is format, the biennials, and then also talk about a little bit about content, the content of the biennial. I spent some time yesterday going to the different places that where you have been working. I thank you very much for the risk that you have taken by revealing the landscapes of inequality of American city, no? And this is something that I've been to the US many, many times, and every time I come here, I am still shocked by the wealth that is surrounding us here versus the extreme segregation and poverty and to some extent despair in certain neighborhoods. It's really shocking because of the wealth that surrounds us in public spaces like the Millennium Park. I don't know how much that place cost versus other areas of the city. You know? So I think that the work that you have done has a lot to do, for instance, with other biennials like Manifesta, where I had the chance to collaborate, where there's a certain work in order to say, do something about the places where the biennials are happening, versus other biennials like maybe Shenzhen or even Venice, which is the one that is bringing us here. My question is to be going to the point. Do you think the future of biennials should be this way?
I don't know that I can speak for all biennials, but I think it should be understood as an opportunity for biennials, especially to think about how an architecture biennial can in fact be different from, let's say, an art biennial in terms of where are there opportunities to begin to think about how do you begin to engage the city, and so what can, in fact, be the contribution of the biennials to the city's making, in some ways, over time. And And I think it is something that the Chicago Architecture Biennial is interested in continuing. One of the images I showed early on was this idea that the city is the site, and that's actually something that Sarah Herda had expressed as the artistic director, or one of the artistic directors with Joseph Grima of the first Architecture Biennial. And I think in some ways, this one really begins to show that that can in fact happen. I think the key thing too, though, is I think trying to figure out, and the challenge I think for biennials in doing that is to really think through where are they making those contributions, what begins to be the engagement that's taking place in advance of the biennial, because I think otherwise you do run the risk of implementing things in an area, and then which is kind of in some ways often the history of expos. That expos can bring a lot of construction into us and kind of create a temporary urbanism, and then if you go back to those maybe a year or two later, they are no longer active. And so I think that combination of really trying to say what are ways in which one can interject something that can be meaningful in time in terms of a contribution is something to think about. And I think, again, part of what happened here, I had been working with one neighborhood in particular for a long period of time, but I think through those organizations and individuals knowing other organizations and individuals, when I was asked to be artistic director, I was able to I won't say super quickly, but expand out in terms of finding out what were some other groups that I might engage in. To me, one of the things I quickly wanted to do was make sure I wasn't focused only on one neighborhood, and I think also not exclusively showing or working within community gardens. So to begin to show that there are a diversity of interests, that it is across multiple neighborhoods in terms of these are neighborhoods that have been under-resourced, but at the same time, I don't think there's a shortage of ideas, and so really looking to engage those different organizations and communities to begin to demonstrate that fact. And I think so I was trying to do this with 2 sites, but I think through the biennial also beginning to present to the city a larger how this can in fact be a larger idea, rather than thinking of it only as something that happens intermittently by different organizations over time. So I think demonstrating that it could happen at a larger scale, I think is important. And so to me, those are maybe some of the ways in which biennials can raise questions, and at times that might be through exhibition about that city, at other times it might be through actual things constructed within that city. So I think it is a new format and approach, perhaps, that I think other biennials should consider.
Mm-hmm. Is there, besides the precise locations that you have described, I think that there's a certain agenda for the future city. We are going to be talking about the future city later. I think there's a certain agenda for the future city that all the sites are showing that can actually be extrapolated to many of the places on the planet. What agenda points could you maybe highlight are there, besides the precise location and the precise needs of the communities where this site is being developed?
Yeah, so I do, in a way, I kind of draw the distinction between the sites, and then at the Graham Foundation and Bronzeville Artist Loft, there's the exhibit. The exhibit begins to highlight, I think, work around the world that I think has some type of underlying similarity. That's across 4 themes that are really kind of drawn out of the available city as a kind of urban design approach. Quickly, those are futures we could have today in terms of what I'm talking about doesn't take a new technology. It's really just a rethinking about resources that are there and how we begin to understand and perceive those resources. And so demonstrating another possibility of what could happen. In this case, that there, and then I guess that goes into the second one, our missions are urbanisms. And so really that one can talk with any community organization, understand what are the ways in which they're engaging a community, what do they identify as the interests and needs, and how one, and I think that's what kind of architects and designers can do, is then also begin to talk about how can that be projected more broadly. So it may, in fact, rather than just being about one space, it could be about a larger collection of spaces, or through a few small changes in what they're doing, even very specifically, how that could be open to thinking about a larger urbanism. I think quickly, Pulaski, I think, is where you see the demonstration of the promise of the available city in terms of three sites that are very different, but all of a sudden you get the larger urbanism of their adjacencies. So you might go to one for an event and start to discover other things. And so I think it's the outdoor spaces help neighborhoods begin to demonstrate what is already happening in their neighborhoods in a way that's different from indoor spaces. You have to kind of already know what's in the building, perhaps, or decide to go to an event. But it's not so much publicly available in a way that you would come across it a little bit more by chance. And then the other ones are a little bit more about the larger urbanism. So something patterned, wild, and free is about an improvisational approach. To a degree, that's happening within each site in terms of the discussions that take place, the direction and how the project manifests between the community organization and the designer. But I think, to me, that's the kind of urban design aspect of articulating a direction for the spaces, but at the same time, in terms of that all of the city-owned vacant lots could be a kind of collective space. But in the structure, it really depends on a lot of collaborators. And so not really being able to truly say this would be the form of the thing as much as the direction, as the kind of urban design that taps back into improvisation. And then a power that's stronger than itself is also an idea about improvisation. In this case, how the small things in aggregate actually begin to add up to a larger landscape, and a kind of a landscape that I think is as varied from an urban standpoint as, say, buildings might be. But in this case, something that could be realized at a kind of smaller scale than kind of, and smaller investment than, say, what buildings would take.
Yeah, I keep wondering what is in your vision of the city. We are also going to talk later about architecture for the people. I don't know if it's for the people, by the people. This is a discussion we have had at this for a while. So, so maybe it's nice to talk about it later. But one of the things I keep wondering, be it for the people, by the people, I wonder what the role of the public sector is in your vision of the city. And I'm just explaining a little bit more. I have the impression sometimes when I visit this, I don't know whether to call it bottom-up interventions, or this kind of projects, of interventions. I have the impression that, in a way, we are letting communities to their own devices, somehow. And we are accepting that the public sector doesn't do anything anymore. The public sector is not here for us, and we have to organize ourselves as good as well as we can, because nobody else is going to help us. And this provokes a certain discomfort in myself. It's maybe an ideological question, especially in times of a pandemic. We just heard that this biennial is also a result of the pandemic. Outdoor spaces were preferred over indoor spaces. And one of the things that I have learned from this pandemic is actually that we need the public sector. Otherwise, we won't get out. There will be no vaccines. So anyway, going back to urbanism, what is the role of the public sector in your vision of the city?
Yeah, one in the specific case, it's I think it is maybe also just thinking about kind of relationship. In a way, to me, there is an implied policy. I think that's kind of a next step for me, is to beginning to outline that more fully. I think especially as I've now had in discussions with different groups, and even I think the long-term plans of each one of those groups has different variations. So I think in some case, but I think too, because what we're talking about is public land, in terms of it is city-owned land, I think it's a recognition of by the city and by the public that a city can in fact be made up of multiple ways in which the city grows or the city develops. I think currently we're dominated by a singular way, in terms of it really is ultimately through private investment. So in some ways, I think all of the land that I'm talking about is kind of land in waiting for a particular type of development, compared to saying, well, actually, and in this case, the large public benefit would be to say that land is now available to all the communities to begin to create this kind of landscape that I'm talking about. And then that to me, there is a kind of continued role in terms of what that also means in terms of, to a degree, all of these sites. I think all of Chicago has a little bit of contamination across its soil from the long history of industry. But I think that begins to be kind of a principal question. A lot of the sites too had houses on them that were pretty much just raised, and then their basements were filled by pushing all the rubble into the basement. So they are brown sites. They aren't necessarily pristine sites. But I think also really beginning to say, well, what can be larger scale ways in which that land is seeing a type of remediation, and then again, I think working with a kind of community organization. So recognizing, to me, that community organizations in the U.S. are typically, if they're formal, are not-for-profits. And so what is a kind of public not-for-profit partnership that begins to take place? And so it is still kind of tied to the public and understanding. Currently, the public land, what's public land here is land that doesn't get taxed. And so in a way, by saying it could in fact be used for community organizations, it would continue to be untaxed. But at the same time, it begins to have a more immediate benefit compared to currently, as I was saying, it sits in isolation, and if anything, it has a kind of negative impact on all of the communities, because it is a reminder and maybe a catalyst in terms of lack of resources. And then at the same time, currently the only development model is a model that would lead to the displacement of the community that's there. So I think, to me, there is a role in terms of the kind of public sector really starting to understand the different ways in which the city can operate, in that it doesn't have to be an either-or model, that you can really begin to think about how you're having a kind of greater range that begins to take place, rather than thinking of it as a kind of singular type of development.
Did I understand correctly? Do you think that the displacement of communities is inevitable?
I think with kind of our current
With the current model.
Yeah, with the current model, because the current model would start to see larger development, and that would lead to gentrification. And so that's the kind of, I think that's the balance. And that's not to say, like in North Lawndale, they know that they have a declining population. And when I say they know they have a declining population, to the degree to which they fear a loss of city services, in terms of not having enough kind of residents there where the city says, oh, well, we can continue to pick up the trash regularly, et cetera. But then at the same time wanting, not wanting development that would lead to super large and fast increases in taxes. And I think also kind of inflation, which I think the city is seeing a little bit currently right now. There's more interest in being in houses than condos and apartments. And so I think currently unanticipated house values are up. I don't know if that's happening globally around the world, but it's happening, I think, within a lot of cities here. And so even to the cost of home ownership is now something that's more expensive. And so that's what I mean in terms of typically larger development starts to raise values, which then prices out a neighborhood as well.
That makes me think that maybe we should, instead of working with the model, try to change it. That's
right.
You know, so that's one thing. And also picking up on what you just said, no, I think we saw a diagram there in which the amount of vacant spaces in the city of Chicago only equals the loop or doubles the loop.
So the city-owned land pretty much equals the loop, and so compared to there's also private land, which I think the city sometimes acquires over time, which is why there's a fluctuation. And so that land in total equals double the size of the loop.
I think in that sense, if we extrapolating, no, for the city of the future, such amount of vacant land, which is already connected by infrastructure, could be used in order to stop city expansion and saving virgin landscapes and territories from being urbanized. No, I think that is trying to think in big. That's an opportunity in order to, let's say, work with or work against climate change, for instance. No, I think this is a nice way of seeing how a small occupation of vacant lots in a different way can actually help to a bigger agenda. No?
Right.
I think that's...
Yeah, and I think one of the things I've tried to articulate is, because I've encountered some other projects that are talking about how you might utilize all the vacant land, and I think they tend to think of it from a standpoint of a system first, in terms of really saying, oh, well, it could all be utilized for, that you could plant trees in all of it, or that you could somehow introduce something that is maybe in a larger impact relative to, say, global warming or other effects. But to me, I think I've articulated, I think what I'm doing is a little bit more of a communities first.
Yeah, I know.
And so you kind of, it is more through the accumulation of things. And so you could begin to create that kind of aspect and layering, and this is maybe something that cities begin to contribute to, is to understand what's the kind of combination in which, as something is becoming a collective space, it is also contributing to that larger kind of set of issues in terms of air quality and mitigation, but how that builds in time to something that's serving both the characteristics and introducing a new idea of what the city could be, that is in fact a combination of spaces for people, but at the same time spaces that begin to make cities less kind of hardscape heat islands, and introduce ways in which there's better air quality, et cetera. But not thinking of that's what you do first, and then you address communities. That somehow, to me, there is a way in which you can do both
together
at the same time.
Okay. I think that we are running out of time, but I guess that there's somebody in the audience who would like to make some questions to David. There's somebody there.
Two, actually. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Although I think they want you to speak into a mic.
Two, actually. One specific to Chicago and one specific to all cities. With what you just said about moving to rural areas outside the city, jobs have to relocate to rural areas in order for that to happen, because if jobs are in the city, they require transportation to get there. adding to carbon accumulation. So how do we concentrate on putting the jobs where people need to live to locate them? That's number one question. Number two is a bit more specific, that within Chicago itself, recently on the South Side, former President Barack Obama has cited his research library taking park space, public park space. And can you question whether this disadvantages South Side residents or whether it gives them pride and brings in residents of other parts of the city to see conditions there? What are the ramifications of this location of that library on the South Side?
I'll have to qualify my statement of that. I was part of the UIC North Lawndale team offering a counter proposal that would have cited it out in North Lawndale, so I do have to offer that qualification. I think to me, I think there are ways in which one can implement it into a park, but I think to me it's maybe a version of what I'm talking about in terms of what can be the impact of the center, which I think hopefully it is successful in terms of the idea of the center. My experience with presidential libraries, and this was living at one point near the Carter Library and then seeing where some others are cited, is I don't know that presidential libraries on their own typically actually are as transformative as everyone potentially thinks, and so I think it does need to have that kind of programming as a center to begin to be successful. But I think, to me, there's also the question of, and I'm not going to answer the question directly, but I think would there be other sightings, potentially to me, other parks in which it makes greater sense in terms of, in a way, the lakefront is in fact an area that already has a very distinct amenity that draws things to it, in terms of that is where there are other cultural elements as well as business elements that are located, compared to potentially, even in the case here, a site adjacent to or within Washington Park may actually have different benefit in terms of activating or helping to kind of create greater impact on neighborhoods themselves. So to me, there are those types of questions, and that would be arguably the site that was in discussion on the west side, in terms of beginning to have a little bit more immediate neighborhood impact, is something that was the kind of open question or point of differentiation. So I think, to me, it's those aspects, because I'm driven by the site. The disappointing thing about the site currently is it's like totally, it's just how construction happens now. They're like starting from zero. And so even the kind of effort to think about the trees that were there, how do the trees that were there somehow begin to get implemented, was not really something that took place. But I think it's more about, and so to me, I think there is ultimately this aspect of how does the center also begin to in this case, become a part of the park again, in terms of what does it contribute to the park as a park, is something that is the kind of question once it's fully completed and constructed. I have to say I haven't really followed how the plans subsequently developed. In the case of the rural urban, I think there is just that aspect of how do you change commutes. I think, and it's not going to always be a matter of how do you begin to relocate jobs, because I know you do have individuals, like O'Hare is a big employer, but I know you can have somebody that's traveling from the far south side to get to O'Hare for their work. But I think it's also just kind of how do you begin to create situations of livability that are affordable across the city, and so that includes its periphery as well as its center, so that it's not a matter of, to me, it's not a matter of either or, compared to, I think, really having options no matter where the kind of development has happened.
So thank you so much again to David and Javier for this interesting conversation and insights on the available city. We would like to remind everybody that the Biennale is officially open until December 18, but the program and the installations, the activity space, they are visible, and we also have a nice map at the entrance if you want to have a look at it. But then, so what's next, Adi?
Well, so I think we have to start our day. We have a bit of delays, but we will start with the first session of today, which is architecture for the people. Yes, it's for the people. We had a lot of discussions between in the previous edition of Shaping the City, but we have decided to keep for the people. So this theme of today's morning session is explored through the social lens. It focused on the social issues in the city of urban inequity, emerging issues of displacement of communities, and the new spatial identity. The panel will tackle mainly inclusion, social, racial, gender inequity in the city, and their intersectionality with space activation and gentrification. It looks into public participation processes, community regeneration in different cities across the world, but it also looks how emerging technologies are creating new interactions between people and their environment. So with that being said, Lucia, would you like to introduce our moderator for this panel?
Sure. So to launch and moderate the coming session, we are very happy to have with us Edson Kabelfin, Inaugural Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the School of Architecture at Tulane University, where he's also serving as the Director of the Social Innovation and Social Entrepreneurship Program and Professor of Practice of Design Thinking. Edson is an educator, architect, designer, and historian. He was the curator of the Philippine Pavilion at the 16th Venice Architecture Biennale in 2018. He received his PhD in History of Architecture and Urban Development from Cornell University. Together with Edson, today we have Christian Hermansen, Winifred Curran, Magda Mostafa, and Alan Sayek. So while they finish setting up the set, I would like to invite all the speakers to come to the stage. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us for this thematic session on architecture for the people. My name again is Edson Cabalfin. I'll be starting off with a very short presentation of the work that I've done, and then I will lead to each of the speaker who will also then present their work, and then at the end we will have a panel discussion with all of the speakers, and then I think we will have time for a question and answer afterwards. So I'll just start off this session by just discussing a little bit the work that I've done in relation to the Philippine Pavilion at the 16th Venice Architecture Biennial, which I curated. we're in Chicago, but I'll take you to the Philippines. And I'll talk specifically about one of the themes in the exhibition at the Philippine Pavilion, the city who had two navels. I was talking about one of the navels that I'll talk about today is about neoliberal urbanism in the Philippines. And kind of talking about how does it relate to the development of cities, but then also like how it affects people. So I think the question that I'm just posing for today is how does neoliberal urbanism occur in the Philippines? And to clarify a little bit is that then I use the term neoliberalism as economic and social policies that emerged from the late 1970s and the 1980s that were then pushed by the United Kingdom Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and then the US President Ronald Reagan. But it also specifically talks about an ideology promoting free market capitalism, free trade, competition, privatization, deregulation, and minimal state intervention. And right now, it is the dominant economic political condition in most of the world, but then we can also imagine of its socio-cultural implications. And so when we talk about neoliberalism as an ideology, but it also has an impact on cities itself. And so when I talk about neoliberal urbanism, I talk about the production and experience of cities shaped by neoliberal ideology with the aim of making cities competitive, again, following these different ideologies of neoliberalization. So I'll talk about neoliberal urbanism, particularly just in the Philippines for my short presentation. And I'll highlight sort of like 7 phenomenon that's happening, which I know is not unique to the Philippines necessarily, but you will also see this happening in other cities across the world. There are some very specific instances and contexts why this is happening in the Philippines, and that's what I would like to highlight this morning. So one is the phenomenon of the rise of urban enclave mixed-use business districts. And these are purported to be self-sustaining enclave developments which house multi-use functions. Nothing new in terms of mixed-use development cities, right? That's already happening. But what's particular is that these are enclave developments that are happening across the Metro Manila, for example. And this is just an image. You see the global city, Bonifacio Global City, which was built on a former military base, US military base. And then in the background, you kind of like see all of these different pockets of development of high-rises that are emerging within the landscape. Here's another one, Eastwood City, which are, they're touted as cities within kind of like these larger cities. A second, and here's just a map showing kind of where these are happening within Metro Manila and how they're emerging over the last couple of decades. But one particular thing about these enclave developments in the Philippines is that these enclave business districts are driven by the information technology business process outsourcing industry, or ITBPOs. These are companies that offer usually like back-of-house services such as medical and legal transcription. If you're calling, let's say, a service for like your travel, it probably goes to the Philippines and in a lot of these customer service call centers, right? What's crucial with this industry is that the ITBPO industry contributes to 10% of the country's GDP. And so you can imagine like why there's such a big push for such development. And here are just some developments of cities that are, developers are building new construction cities specifically to entice BPO companies who are based in the US, Australia, Canada, and so on. But they are being produced and they're being built in the Philippines to service some of these clients. Again, these are just another example of where you have high-rises of office buildings, but they're coupled also with condominiums and also of commercial works or mixed-use development, enclave developments. A second phenomenon that's happening in the Philippines is the privatization of public spaces. Public spaces now are being controlled by the private sector. Historically, a lot of the public spaces in the Philippines, for example, emerged during the Spanish colonial and American colonial periods, from the 17th century to the late 19th century, like this one in Iloilo. where you do have spaces that are open to the public. Anybody can enter, anybody can leave, and they can do practically whatever they want. But the current trend now is that a lot of these public spaces are now shifting to more of that of malls, shopping centers like this one. This is in Makati, where people are now spending their time and money in all of these developments. What's crucial, though, with this development is that then these public spaces, though purportedly they're open to the public, are not actually fully open, in the sense that these are militarized spaces, because you have to go through security. So there are open parks like these inside shopping malls, and this is in Cebu, for example, where they provide these public amenities. But to get through there, you need to pass through security. And these are just images of how you have to be of a certain type. You know, if you're wearing flip-flops, for example, sometimes you're turned away, again, because the public companies, the private companies set their own rules in terms of who is allowed to enter and who is not allowed to enter these shopping malls, for example. A third phenomenon that's happening is the expansion of the city, I think, which was also mentioned earlier. This is also happening in Metro Manila, where residential subdivisions are being built on the periphery of these cities. Here's a land satellite map of Metro Manila. It's a bit light here, but what this map is showing on the left is from 1989, and then the one on the right is in 2012, where the pink space, the pink color refers to the expansion of the city from maybe, this is like the core, and it's now like expanded to this part. So the exponential growth of the city due to that of this sort of expansion of developments. But this also means that agricultural land that's on the periphery, which was also mentioned earlier, like rural areas, are now being converted to that of residential and commercial spaces. And here's a very stark image of one of these residential subdivisions at the edge of Metro Manila, where these are the subdivisions on the right, residential subdivisions, really took over what was formerly a farmland. And this means that farmers are being displaced, and then agricultural production is reduced to a certain degree. What's also crucial with this sort of push with these residential subdivisions on the periphery are really driven by remittances by the overseas Filipino workers. So there are about 20 million overseas Filipino workers, and they send money back to the Philippines, of which just the remittances contribute another 10% to the country's GDP, which is again pushing a lot of these development. A fourth phenomenon, which is also not just necessarily solely experienced by the Philippines, is that cities are now becoming homogenized. They all look the same. Mark Ojay calls them the non-place. They're anywhere and nowhere at the same time. So these are just some of these gleaming white, cities that seems so exciting and sparkling, but then they also look very much the same everywhere. Another phenomenon, the fifth one, is that of the emergence of a truly 24/7 cities. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of these IT BPO companies are moving to the Philippines, right? What's key about this is that because they're servicing US companies, the Philippines is about 12 to 14 hours behind, ahead of the US. And so which means that they are servicing clients in the US, and so they're working at night. So a typical worker would be coming in at 7 o'clock in the evening, having breakfast at 10 o'clock in the evening, and then they would be they will have lunch at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then leave at 7 o'clock, and then have happy hour at 10 o'clock in the morning. So, but they're also day workers, so the city is really truly 24/7. I don't think even New York can claim that sort of 24/7 condition. So you have 24-hour services, 24-hour restaurants, and commercial. And it's a very different experience at night. There's also the effect of this sort of night workers to that of the workers from the IT BPO services. So they live, work, and play at night, But what's happening also is that there are studies now showing that there are health impacts, as you can imagine, on these workers who are working at night, right? Because it's against their circadian rhythm. So there's like health issues now being associated with these IT BPO workers. And then a sixth phenomenon related to neoliberal urbanism in the Philippines is that of the expansion of slums and squatter settlements within the city. So it's not that some of these informal settlements are sort of just at the edge. They're actually integrated within the city. And here are just a couple of pictures. This is close to the port area, where and then you have the central business district in Manila, on the kind of like on the left, where you have this integration between that of informal settlements and that of these high-rise mixed-use development buildings. Now, why is this happening? Because then, who do you think are workers working in these cities, enclave cities? You need janitorial staff, drivers, gardeners, service workers, and they're all coming from low-wage workers, right? They're provided by low-wage workers, and they're having a hard time finding places to live in the city. So where do they live? They go and live in some of these informal settlements where rent is affordable. So there are this sort of juxtaposition where you need the informal, you need the cheap laborers to be able to supply the workers for the cities, and yet the cities, these enclave cities, are purporting to be self-sustaining, but they really need the help of workers outside those enclave developments. And then, can you move it one more, please? Yes, and so I'm just showing you this image again of Bonifacio Global City, where here is the gleaming, sparkling city, but then you have on the right the area where you have these informal settlements. And then this is an aerial view of Makati here, Central Business District on the right, and just right across this expressway are Bangkal and San Isidro areas where you have all of these informal settlements as well. And here's another one, Eastwood City. I've shown this earlier, one of the pictures here on the left. And then you have Santolan area where you have some of these informal settlements. So these are all sort of integrated together with the informal settlements and that of these enclave developments. And then the last idea of this neoliberal urbanism in the Philippines is what David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession. That the growth of the city, the accumulation of capital, of course, would have an impact on certain populations that are mostly not powerful, they're probably low income, and therefore they're not benefiting in the same way that others are benefiting from this development. So these sort of 7 phenomena, there are actually more. Again, these are some that are happening also in other parts of the world. But what's key also to the Philippines is that then it's also showing like how what might be happening in another country would definitely have a palpable effect on the Philippines and vice versa, and how all cities are interconnected. And as the pandemic had also shown us, that everyone is actually interconnected. So to end, I'll just pose a couple of questions. And maybe just to point out that in neoliberalism, there will always be winners and losers. And we have to think about that then, who wins and who loses. But my questions will include, what will happen to the future of cities if it continues under this track of neoliberalization? Especially that this is the dominant ideology and the dominant economic political condition. What will happen to our public spaces and civic commons in the future if we continue that our public spaces continue to be privatized? What will happen to the future generations of Filipinos who work at night if we continue this sort of trend? What will happen to our farmlands and food production in the future as cities continue to expand? How can we design our cities that are ennobling to all and not just to a select few? And then, how can architecture in cities empower and ennoble people? And then, I think I begin to think about how can cities become more equitable, more inclusive, humane, and sustainable. So with that, I will end my presentation, and then I'd like to introduce our first speaker. just pull up my... So our first speaker is Christian Hermansen. He's an architect and he is a professor of architecture in the Oslo School of Architecture and Design and also in Tianjin University. He studied and practiced architecture in Chile, the USA, and Britain. From 1994 to 2002, he worked in the Mackintosh School of Architecture, where he was the director of the postgraduate studies, and with Elder and Canon Architects, where the work won numerous awards. In 2002, he moved to Oslo, Norway, where he was appointed professor and head of the Institute of Architecture. So let us all welcome Christian Hermansen.
Can someone please change the slides?
I can do it, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Now, do I have to press this?
Yes, like.
Okay. Thank you to the European Cultural Center for this invitation. It's great to be here. I love Chicago. It's a great city, in spite of all the problems that have been highlighted today. What I would like to do in these 15 minutes I have is to talk about our position. And when I say our position, it's the Scarcity and Creativity Studio, a design-build studio that a colleague and I have been leading for the past 10 years. And comment a bit about what we understand in the studio in the sentence, architecture for the people. What is this? So we are a design-build studio in the Oslo School of Architecture and Design. And we have, next please. We have built with our student teams all around the world. We build basically 2 projects per year, 1 per semester. Most of the projects have been in Norway and Chile. In our view, the sentence architecture for the people is more contentious than what it first sounds like. And this probably led to the dilemma that the organizers had in the name itself. Next, please. And next. If one tries to imagine architecture without people, which would be a corollary of architecture with people, it is ultimately almost not possible. Even if one thinks of building types in which the people are not central or don't appear to be central, like zoos, for example, or a factory which is totally automated. In the end, these are very much geared towards people. Next. We believe architecture is intrinsically bound to people, which is a pretty obvious sentence, and without people there really would not be architecture. What is interesting to us is to establish the nature of the relationship between people and buildings. At one end of this relationship are those who believe that architecture has a determining role in people's lives. For example, Le Corbusier, when he writes, "It is the question of building which lies at the root of the social unrest of today, architecture or revolution." Or Sumaya Valley, nearer our time, from Counterspace Architects. She says, "Architecture is complicit in segregation, othering, and displacement. And Joburg is such a profound example of this. But it can also be a force for the opposite, for bringing people together, highlighting and amplifying voices and identities through design. Both of these positions, I sense, believe that architecture has the capacity to determine social relationships. Next, please. That's okay. On the other side are those who do not seem overly concerned whether architecture can or cannot affect the behavior of people or social relations between them. Here we find ourselves at the fuzzy edge between architecture and sculpture. Sculpture is, like architecture, for the people to observe, dream, and think about. The main difference between the two is whether or not their main purpose is to shelter human activities. Next, please. This house, or this image, provides shelter, but not habitability, and seems not to have been one of the designer's main concerns. These positions, those who prioritize social relations and those who prioritize form over function, are put forth as illustrations. Most architecture production lies somewhere in between these extremes. Next. Now, our view, that is the view of our studio, is that architecture is a service to society, consisting in providing shelter to those activities which society chooses to shelter. In our view, it is not the architect who should decide what needs to be sheltered, but society. Within these strictures, architects may choose which sectors of society they wish to serve, but not dictate what they should be served with. Our studio has sought to work with disadvantaged communities, those who do not have the means to employ architects, but we have been careful not to impose our values, our own socio-political views on those we serve. This is not a plea for neutrality. Each member of our team cultivates and proselytizes their views as they see fit. But we are careful not to hoist those views on our clients through our architecture. We believe this attitude does not interfere either with the radical nature of the project program nor the possibility to make good architecture. The project I will show seeks to demonstrate how this position plays out in reality. Next, please. The Wave, public performance space in Valparaíso, Chile. Next, please. And here I have to clarify that when we think of the term, or when we use the term people, we're not thinking necessarily of the community group or only of the community group we're working with, but we're thinking more of the socio-cultural environment which people have made in the past, are living in the present, and hope to make for the future. So our view of people is not limited to the community group, but has a much wider sense. Valparaíso is Chile's main port. It's 116 kilometers northwest of Santiago, the capital. Hills are what makes Valparaíso. Pablo Neruda, the poet, writes in his Ode to Valparaíso, "Valparaíso, what nonsense you are. What a crazy, insane port. Your mounded head disheveled," etc., etc. It's a long poem. I won't go in the total. The city was declared UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2003 because, I quote, "it is an excellent example of late 19th century urban and architectural development in Latin America." Next, please. Valparaíso developed in the latter half of the 19th century as a result of being in the shipping route from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans. It attracted a large number of European immigrants, especially Italians, who built up the city. The decline of the city of Valparaíso started on August 15th, 1914, when the Panama Canal was opened. And it became no longer necessary to navigate around South America. Next, please. To give a little flavor on the people that built Valparaiso, which for us is an important cultural element of any architecture intervention. Let me outline the story of a distant relative of mine, Clemente Torreti. Born in Turin in 1836, he studied chemistry in Paris and migrated to South America after the unification of Italy in 1859. He went first to La Paz, Bolivia, where he succeeded Enzo Pizzi in the Antigua Botica y Drogueria Boliviana. Pizzi claimed to have discovered the chief active ingredient for the stimulative virtues of the coca plant, which he proposed to call cocaine. Pizzi sent some samples for analysis to Friedrich Wöhler, the head of the chemistry department at Göttingen University, who in turn gave them to his graduate student Albert Niemann. Niemann declared that Pizzi's sample only contained gypsum. On the other hand, Niemann obtained his PhD in 1860 with a dissertation on the new organic base in the coca leaves, which earned him recognition as the discoverer of cocaine. However, Clemente Torreti in La Paz not only succeeded in extracting coca from coca leaves utilizing the records in the Pizzi lab, but produced and sold a tonic elixir of cocaine at the Antigua Botica. Moreover, Torreti was for some time an important provider of coca leaves to the Paris and Milan markets, where they were used to make products such as Vin Mariani. Torreti's interests were not limited to drugs. In February 1867, he signed a contract with the Bolivian president, Mariano Melgarejo, in virtue of which he would install the machines needed to convert the coins circulating in Bolivia into legal tender of lesser intrinsic value. He would melt the circulating coins and introduce a metal which was not silver, so he could print more coins. Due to the strong protest by the Peruvian government and local Bolivian merchants, the contract was rescinded and the coin-making equipment was sold to the Bolivian government. At this time, Clemente Torreti felt it necessary to move to Valparaiso, or he was chased out of Bolivia, where he established a pharmacy. He seemed to have kept an interest in coin production, as his initials appear in coins from Bolivia, Cuba, and Haiti. Now, this is a long story to give you an idea of the nature of the people that were making this city of Valparaiso at the time. This is the time in which, in the United States, this country, the West was being conquered from St. Louis west. So that's the past of the city. Now the present. Next, please. Chile today. In Chile, the richest 10% own 70% of its wealth. And here we fall again into neoliberalism. Chile's recent economic history has been largely shaped by Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship. Since his fall in 1990, the government has been relatively stable and its residents have achieved one of the highest standards of living in Latin America. This economic growth has catapulted the country into membership of the Rich Nations Club, the OECD. At the same time, the OECD has declared Chile as the member with the most unequal economic distribution amongst its population, with a Gini coefficient of 0.52. As a comparison, Norway has 0.27, which is about half, and the US 0.47, which is quite close to Chile's. Adding to this problem is the fact that Chile's expenditure on social services is comparatively small. Of the 10 countries in the world with the widest gap between the rich and the poor, only Mexico spends less on social services than Chile. Inequality has been most evident in education, resulting in the student protests between 2011 and 2013, which became internationally known as the Chilean Winter. and eventually led the conservative government to allow a publicly elected body to rewrite the current country's constitution. Next, please. Our clients. Our clients are called Sitio Eriazo, which means empty brown site, I guess. They are a collective whose aim is to replace Chile's neoliberal structure, which they consider responsible for the extreme inequality in the country. Sitio Eriazo recycles the waste produced by society as a means to generate tools of resistance, which may take the form of architecture, theater, music, circus, painting, crafts, or education, to build modes of working and learning that will alter our relationship to the environment. Their proselytizing is carried out through performances and seminars. To reaffirm their aims, they recover derelict urban sites in the historic center of Valparaiso to turn them to public use. For the WAVE project, the project that they commissioned from us, Sitio Eriazo took over a derelict site in Ecuador 428 and began to clear and prepare it for their multiple activities. Next, please. The site is located in Avenida Ecuador, a street in the city center, which is the site of many public protests. So it's associated with a deeply political role in the city. Next, please. The project we developed for them. The WAVE takes the form of the classical amphitheater, circular in plan with tiers of seats that rise from a central open arena and focus on it. It departs from the classical form in that it rises by means of a ramp which starts next to the entrance door to the site and has the double function of allowing access to the upper seats and to a second level at the back of the site. This second level, which is 6 meters above the street, houses an urban vegetable garden which supplies the kitchen. Next, please. Extending the geometry of the amphitheater, there's a slanted pergola whose structure leans against a retaining wall and is planted with vines, which eventually will supply shade to the workshop and fruit for the kitchen. Behind the seating are the ancillary facilities, a kitchen with an adobe pizza oven and barbecue grill, from which Sitio Eriazo dispenses food during performances, workshop benches for craft activities, a toilet, and areas for group meetings. The lower part of the underside is used for storage. Next, please. The WAVE project has been in use for 7 years. Sitio Eriazo offers an average of 2 free performances per week. The WAVE, La Ola in Spanish, has become a regular venue for live performances of all kinds, performances that focus on political change. Next. This is the team of students and staff of the studio that built this project in a 5-week period in which we stayed in Valparaiso. Next. A small plug for a forthcoming book on the work that the studio has done during a decade. And next. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian. For our second presentation, let us welcome Professor Winifred Curran. Dr. Winifred Curran is Professor of Geography at DePaul University, and she's an urban geographer. Her research has focused on understanding the effects of gentrification on the urban landscape, looking at labor, industrial retention, policing, environmental gentrification, and the gendering of urban policy. She's the author of the book Gender and Gentrification, published by Routledge in 2018, and co-editor with Tina Hamilton of the book Just Green Enough, Urban Development and Environmental Gentrification. Dr. Winifred Curran.
Thank you. Could we pull up my slides? Unless it's just from where I am, it's not. A glimpse of something. So anyway, I'm going to be talking about gender and gentrification, and to pick up on the recurrent theme of neoliberal urbanism already, I focus on gentrification because I find that it's the way that cities are developing now. That even in cities that aren't experiencing gentrification, it's kind of the goal of urban planners that they will experience gentrification. And so I want to argue that in the first, there we go. So I love this image in the first slide because it shows how when we're redeveloping the city, we're building upon existing infrastructures. And that's not just both the physical infrastructure, but also existing inequalities. Right, so we can choose to reinforce those existing inequalities or to dismantle them. And unfortunately, most of the time, we choose to reinforce them. So gender, I think, is one of the ways in which one of the kind of infrastructures of inequality that is continuously being reinscribed into the city, but that doesn't get a whole lot of attention. As that. So it's one of, I argue that gender is one of the axes of inequality that is obviously works together with race and class and ability and immigration status and all sorts of other identifiers to reinscribe certain inequalities on the urban landscape, and that gentrification is one of the ways in which this is done. And of course, very few things kind of illustrate how important gender is to the experience of everything than the pandemic, right? That we saw very clearly in the pandemic the ways in which, most especially the gender division of labor, actively is still doing the work of disadvantaging women. And of course, there's also the gendered wage gap, which is extremely important in differentiating women's experience of the city. And then that gentrification just exacerbates these inequalities. Next slide, please. Gender, though, is often used as a way to kind of sell the city, especially to sell the deindustrialized, post-industrial city. And this is just pulled a variety of real estate advertisements that kind of use gender to sell the city as kind of safer, more accessible, friendlier to certain populations than would have been the case previously, especially in Chicago, for example. The city of broad shoulders needs to be kind of feminized in order to be made post-industrial. Marguerite Vandenberg, a sociologist in the Netherlands, calls this genderfication, right? This sort of coding of spaces as female-friendly as a way to make them more accessible to capital and speculation. But of course, as these advertisements show, this is a very narrow, particular version of femininity. It is very white, it is very upper class, it is very thin, right? This is not, any true representation of gender in the city. And also interestingly, the gendered wage gap is actually broader for women with a college degree and higher. So even class does not protect women from this level of oppression. Next slide, please. And of course, what's important to remember, and I'll illustrate this with three examples specifically from Chicago, is that this kind of claiming of space, this making the city post-industrial, bringing luxury back to the urban core, is predicated upon the displacement. So again, as Edison said earlier, accumulation by dispossession, right? That's sort of the images of the women I showed in the previous slide requires an army of labor, overwhelmingly of women of color, in order to enable that lifestyle. And that those jobs tend to be very low paid because they are jobs that have historically been feminized. Childcare, housekeeping, food preparation, right? This was work that people were used to getting for free from women inside the home. When women enter the labor force, the workers who emerge to kind of do that work that professional women are no longer doing are expected to do it at very low wages because people don't value it because, again, this was work that had historically been done for free. Next slide, please. And so I want to highlight some examples of gentrification in Chicago that have actively worked to again kind of reinscribe the disadvantage that gender creates. And again, I'm talking about the social construction of gender. This has nothing to do with, actual biological difference. So this is a picture of Cabrini Green, one of Chicago's most notorious public housing developments, and one of the first to be torn down and redeveloped as part of what was called the Plan for Transformation, but as part of a broader national and also global trend of redeveloping public housing, we call it in the US, social housing as it's called in Europe. So obviously in the American context, this is very much a racial project, right? Work that has been done has showed that the public housing developments that are most likely to experience this kind of redevelopment are those that have the largest population of Black residents. But something that unites all of these, and public housing, again, not just across the city, this country, and the world, is the percentage of the population that is female. Public housing is a feminized phenomenon. Again, across contexts, across cities, across countries, typically over 80% of the population of public housing is female. So any redevelopment of that, of public housing is going to be a gendered issue, but we very rarely think of it this way. Right, but again, it's because of the gendered wage gap and the gender division of labor that you see overwhelmingly single female heads of households in public housing, and also senior citizens are dominated by women because women tend to live longer. So this is explicitly a feminine, a gendered issue, though we are not in the habit of thinking of it as such. Next slide, please. And so this is in part what replaced this. This is a massive project. It's still going on. It's been 15 years in the making. But this is the kind of housing that is replacing high-rise public housing. And so there are a number of things to notice about this. First, it's a lot less housing, right? And so again, by definition, we are rebranding territory that has been stigmatized historically, but we're doing that in a way that replaces the existing population. So again, as in the case in this particular example of Cabrini Green, but again, it's true across public housing redevelopments across the country and the world, is that typically when this is done, only about 20% of the original population is able to return. So these are very active projects of displacement, right? There's nothing accidental about this. It is purposeful, just an attempt to remove populations that are considered unattractive from areas of the city that had previously been stigmatized, but are now being revalorized because of the rise of the post-industrial city. So that building over public housing may make it look nicer, as in this picture, but it does nothing to improve the lives of the people who were there before. And it not only displaces people from their neighborhoods, from their housing, and makes it much more difficult for them to get housing, because again, the people most disadvantaged on the housing market, especially in a gentrified housing market, are women with children. Landlords do not like children, right? They're messy, they're sticky, they're destructive. It's very hard for single female heads of households to find affordable housing. But also, so we displace people, we have displaced communities of care, right? So even though maybe certain public housing developments don't look pretty often, they are very intricate infrastructures of care, right? Where women have, again, overwhelmingly women, excuse me, have historically relied on each other to kind of, for mutual aid, to kind of do the care work that the city has, for which the city has abdicated its responsibility. And so that's why this kind of change is so important and so destructive to these communities. Next slide, please. So the second example, excuse me, I'm sorry. This is a mural from the Pilsen neighborhood in Chicago. The murals in my first slide were also from Pilsen. Thank you so much. Emergency water delivery. And I like this mural because, again, it's an image of, this is on the side of a restaurant in the Pilsen neighborhood, which is on the near southwest side of Chicago. It's an overwhelmingly Mexican-American neighborhood, but one that is experiencing very intense gentrification right now. And so, again, this is kind of a picture of what I like to think of as a community of care. It is multi-generational, it is multi-ethnic, multi-racial. It's about, care and production and food and education and kind of all the things that we say that we value in neighborhoods. But because it's an immigrant neighborhood, it has been targeted for gentrification and displacement. Next slide, please. And this is the kind of development that's coming to Pilsen. So Pilsen has attracted a lot of speculative development because it is a neighborhood that is zoned for higher density use than most of its existing buildings. So that means the profit potential here is quite great. You can buy a single family home, that has not necessarily been maintained. This was a neighborhood that was redlined well into the 1970s. Knock it down, build a 3 to 4 story condo in its place, each for at least $300,000. And so again, the profit potential here is huge. And the city is in the quality of life plan for this neighborhood in kind of planning visions for this neighborhood that have been put forward by CMAP. The vision is for the kind of building that's there in the center for condominium development, luxury condominium development that is maybe 1 to 2 bedrooms at most. But as the mural I showed you previously shows, Pilsen is a multi-generational neighborhood. It is a neighborhood where where families live with grandparents, with cousins, with uncles, the extended family. And that, again, that extended family is part of how people are able to survive and afford the city, right, by having that kind of community care available to them. By knocking down the existing structures that have enabled this, typically kind of 2 and 3 flat style buildings, where there may often be one rental unit that helps to support the cost of maintaining the building. By destroying those kinds of buildings, we're displacing alternative ways of living, right? That you can't have a mother, father, multiple children, and grandma in a 2-bedroom condo, right? That's just not gonna work. And so the way in which we are building the city is forestalling other possibilities of living. And again, this is in a way that's very gendered because it's people who are doing a lot of the care work of the city who are being displaced in this process. Next slide, please. And my last example, this is a rendering of a development called Lincoln Yards. This is a massive development that has just groundbreaking has just begun on the first building. That is built over what had been a planned manufacturing district, actually a very successful manufacturing district within the city, but this is relatively close to where we are now in the Lincoln Park neighborhood of Chicago, a very high-income neighborhood, and so people, didn't spend $3+ million on their homes to live across the street from an industrial zone. So the industrial zone is displaced, and this kind of, shiny vision that you see here on the left is what is supposed to replace it, with ultimately, eventually, 6,000 residential units in its place. But again, in the way in which this is gendered and how little care has been put into thinking about the work of care. So 6,000 units, there is no commitment yet to specifically build a school, right, or any of the other kind of infrastructure of care that you would think would be necessary in a neighborhood with 6,000 people. And so on the right is a picture from the Chicago Teachers Union strike that happened in 2019. This is part and really kind of kicked off a national wave of strikes, teachers union strikes, but very explicitly making the link between the kinds of public money that are put into Lincoln Yards. So Lincoln Yards will receive up to $1.3 billion in public subsidy at a time when our schools are, rampantly underfunded. And so very directly making the link between, what we do value, right, the kind of infrastructure and architecture we are building, and what we actively are not building, right, that we are not building future generations. We are not building up our public school system. Next slide. And I'll just kind of close, this is the last slide, is where I see hope in this activism, right? So one reason why I kind of argue for a focus on gender, again, not to the exclusion of anything else, but just as another kind of node in the constellation of inequity and oppression, is that there are commonalities to be found across gender. Because the experience of gender depression is a commonality, then there are ways to come together. And so I see the Chicago Teachers Union strike as an example of this kind of making of community that is, at least in part, based on gendered solidarity. Because of course, who is it who does the work of teaching our children? At home, it's overwhelmingly women, and in schools, it's overwhelmingly women. And I actually had my own children's school teacher joke during the strike that they were trying to convince, maybe some cops or firefighters to come out with them, because that way they'd have some men on the picket line, and then maybe the city would actually take them seriously, right? And so there is this, so again, across class, across race, across neighborhoods in the city, there is this common experience of gender depression. And so I'd like to offer as kind of the hopeful note to finish on, that there is then a kind of common identity upon which to build communities of care that can make us think differently about how we build the city, and to think about the available city not just as the spaces that are available, but the people who are here, right? To plan for the people who are actually here doing the work of the city, rather than trying to build developments like Lincoln Yards that are meant to kind of to attract the mythical, or not quite mythical, creative class that all cities are going after, right? To plan for the available city of the people who are here, rather than who you would prefer to be here, because they are upper income and can pay higher property taxes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Winifred. So for our third presentation, let us welcome Professor Magda Mostafa. Magda Mostafa is an architect, scholar, and educator, and is currently an autism design consultant at Progressive Architects. She's also an associate professor of design at the American University in Cairo. She's the author of Autism Aspects, Design Guidelines, the world's first research-based design framework for autism worldwide. Aspects has been presented at the United Nations, Harvard's GSD, Columbia University GSAPP, the National Autistic Society in the UK, Ireland's SIM, the World Autism Organization, the Royal Town Planning Institute of the UK, and the London Festival of Architecture, among others. It was awarded the UIA International Research Award in 2014 and was showcased in her TED Talk in 2015. Let us welcome Professor Magda Mostafa.
Thank you, Edson, and thank you, ECC, for putting all of this together, and to my fellow speakers. So as Edson kindly introduced, I'll be talking about maybe on a smaller scale of the individual through the lens of the autistic and the neurodiverse experience of our cities. But just to do the little academic exercise of semantics that we've all been doing this morning, I was really, the word available city really resonated with me when I first read it. And it's interesting, this morning David Brown was talking about it almost as the utilitarian spatial infrastructure that are available in all of our cities and the different constructs and dynamics of that. But I'm also interested in what it connotates as a departure from other terminologies that we use when we think about autism, like inclusion or accessibility, that embedded within them is a kind of othering. So when you think about inclusion, you have to think of who are you including, who is the additional, who is the outside that is coming in. But the available city, I thought, was an interesting notion because it was more democratizing. It was more about an infrastructure of affordances across an urban scape that could be made available to whoever it is that found agency to engage with them. So it was very much about democracy and engaging of space. And then nestled within that, the idea of architecture, again, I did the mental exercise. Is it for the people? Is it by the people? Is it of the people? And it's interesting because for the people thinks of people as objects, and by the people thinks of people as process, and of the people maybe thinks of people as their agency and how they can embody agency within space, which is interesting. But actually the word that I was interested in more than the for, by, and of is the people. Who do we mean when we say people? And Winifred was just talking about predominantly it's white male. It's very gendered, it's very racial, but at least the research that we've been doing, definitely confirms that is not the autistic and it's not the neurodiverse when we think of who are our users of our spaces in our cities. And that's really what interested me in this conversation. So that parallels evolution of the disability model over time from the very medicalized model where individuals, whether they're with autism or other forms of disability and vulnerability, are seen as the problem themselves. They are pathologized, they are problematized, they are the problem to be fixed so that they can come into space and be like everyone else. And luckily, that model has evolved over the past few decades, largely because of movements around social justice and other social political movements, to the point where we've reached today what we call a cultural model, where disability, autism, and other forms of difference are seen as an equally valid but different way of perceiving the world, engaging in the world, and being within the world. And that runs in parallel to how we think as designers from the hierarchy that was first part of the medical model, which is the hierarchy of sympathy, because that's what the medical model generates within us as designers, that we feel sympathy for this user who is quote unquote different and needs to be accommodated for, to one that about a position of empathy, which perhaps is less of a hierarchy, brings us down to equal playing grounds. But more recent conversations, at least in the autistic space, is Damian Milton's concept of double empathy, that it's not necessarily the individual that is problematized or the space or the context that is problematized, but it's the interaction, and that we all have a shared responsibility in constructing these barriers and challenges that individuals face within the space. And this is particularly interesting for me because I've recently tried to push that even further and talk about the autistic as expert, and that there's expertise to be learned, there's experience, there's mechanisms, there are processes that we can learn as designers and creators of our spaces and our cities from the autistic lens, the autistic perspective, the neurodiverse perspective, that is not only a pathway to be more inclusive and accessible for that population, but our research also shows that it makes spaces that are better for everyone, and it also intersects across groups that helps individuals with Alzheimer's, dementia, other cognitive challenges, with aging, with other issues, particularly around the sensory cognition of space. So that's an interesting departure. And from the design perspective, and again, Winifred was just talking about that, historically we were taught to think of the person as a white male, 6 foot tall, able-bodied, seeing, moving, perfectly mobile person. And actually that person doesn't exist. I don't think I could see in this room a person that fits perfectly within this model. And the reality is much more outside of that model. And as designers, we have been historically taught to think of that as abnormal, quote unquote. So any departure from that is seen as special. And our work is trying to change and expand, again, who do we mean when we say person or people or user, to be a little bit more expansive. And this also has to be looked at through the lens of intersectionality. And I love this art piece by Mona Chalabi, who looks at the city of New York and abstracts it down into these beautiful graphics that she statistically says if New York City were distilled to 100 people, 68 would be persons of color, 37 would be immigrants, 19 would be in poverty, 11 would have a disability, and 14 would be seniors over the age of 85. And that doesn't add up to 100, so we immediately see the intersectionality across these groups, and there are other groups that we can also look at. But I think this graphically kind of represents how these lenses that we're looking through have impact beyond just the autistic. So often in my work, people critique it in that this is fine and interesting, but you're talking about a very limited, small population. The CDC, my friend Erin just shared with me, has recently published new prevalence statistics of 1 in 44 falling within the autism spectrum, which is much larger than it was a decade ago, but still, people see that as a small population. What we're arguing is these needs intersect across other groups and actually benefit larger populations, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. So I've operationalized this thinking in, as Edson kindly introduced, the Autism Aspects Design Index, which was born from a very small clinical study that we did in a school with students and teachers and wonderful parents, but over a decade of design work. And it's 7 principles. They're acoustics, spatial sequencing, which asks us to think about spaces like stories or narratives that we move through. Escape, which is interesting because it allows you to remove yourself from space when you're needed, when this overstimulation that typically happens with neurodiversity and autism. Compartmentalization, which is, again, an organizing of space into only what needs to be available for us at that moment to avoid this overstimulation. I love the slides you were showing us, Edson, earlier about these neoliberal policies. It always resonates with me how much sensory pollution is in those spaces and how much our spaces have been commodified and become canvases for advertising and capitalism. And the ripple effect of that on the autistic and neurodiverse communities, that it creates this sensory pollution that overstimulates, overloads, and can even be an actual barrier to your access to space because of that sensory overload. So thinking through space around transitions, how we move from space to space, how we think about our spaces through the senses, and of course, safety is kind of the overriding boundary that we always have to think about. The aspects has been used in multiple different environments. It's now currently being used in 5 continents around the world, in buildings and studios and teaching and scholarship. And I think that's interesting because it's not always for autistic and neurodiverse users. It's often for other populations. In this past year, over the COVID year, one of our proud achievements, despite all the challenges, were that we worked with a group in Europe at Dublin City University to create the autism-friendly design guide. And in it, we developed a 2.0 version of aspects. We took a second look at it and expanded it, so those 7 have become now 15, and they've been operationalized in this autism-friendly design audit, which is like a checklist of how you can think about space in a way to make it more accessible for the autistic, the neurodiverse, and anyone who is challenged with overstimulation or understanding the senses. And we're also making sure that this aligns with other more common building standards, like, for example, the WELL building standard also talks about comfort and other sensory issues. And we're looking at how our work aligns or contrasts with these kinds of standards in the efforts to make it more mainstream. So more of our spaces are designed with this in mind. So how does this all relate to the city? What are aspects of the city? What is the autistic experience of the city? And I'm going to go very quickly through some of the strategies that aspects provides that can translate to the city. So over this past year, in engaging with the Autism Friendly University, which we saw kind of as an urban microcosm, as a mini city. Dublin City University is an urban campus, 18,000 students, completely embedded with the city of Dublin, and had very much of the urban infrastructures that we see in our cities. So it was a great experimental ground to think about how these concepts can translate to the urban space. So here we see the concept of spatial sequencing, which is embedding spatial infrastructures and thinking about space in the sequence of what it is like to experience them. So as you arrive from the very loud outdoor public crowd and how you enter into maybe a quieter space, a study space, a library space, a residential space, how that sequencing happens and how you can build the spatial infrastructure to make it more seamless and more navigatable for different groups. Another principle that's really important, and it reminded me as David was talking this morning, this idea of escape, that cities can afford opportunities for us to remove ourselves from these overstimulating, over-commodified space if we have enough of an infrastructure of sensory escape around it. And all of these Biennale sites, for example, across Chicago or in Venice or in other cities that have engaged with art and architecture this way, are a great infrastructure to leverage for these types of spaces. How can we rethink these spaces? David was talking about the lifetime of them post-Biennale. Creating sensory escape as a network and what I call the escapescape, I think, is really very key. And it also plays into technology because these spaces can be linked with smart systems. You can report on them. You can take metrics to measure what the sensory qualities are within them. People can have access to them based on that information in a way that's, I think, really interesting. Another concept that began as an internal concept of compartmentalizing interior spaces, we took out and scaled up to the typical streetscape that was around the urban campus in Dublin. And what we do is we take the street section and think of it as a transition from the quiet outdoor transition spaces as we enter a building to the loudest, fastest part of the street, which is where the vehicles would be moving, and to create these compartments of space so there's a gradual sensory progression as you move. And this is an idea that came from walking and working with the students as they moved around campus and how difficult it was for them. We forget how overwhelming our cities are. So we create these little enclaves, these schools or centers or libraries that are accessible to people, but we don't think about the infrastructure that we need to get there that can be just as inaccessible. And finally, the idea of transition. It's those pockets of space that help you move from the high stimulation. Imagine someone arriving from a bus or the subway to a school space or an office space to allow those moments of sensory transition that are so important. Throughout my work, I've always believed that the autistic voice is central to what we do, and it has informed so much of what we do. So all of our processes are fully participatory. But recently, we've started thinking about those tools that we use, like focus groups, interviews, surveys, design thinking workshops that are often, again, designed from the normative lens of people who can socialize, people who can verbalize, people who can engage physically with others, people who can make eye contact, people who are comfortable with very creative spaces and multimedia all at once, which is not the typical autistic profile. So we have, over this past few years, been rethinking the actual processes themselves to make them inclusive for the autistic voice, because it's one thing to say I'm doing a participatory process, but if that process excludes certain voices, then how participatory is it truly? So the process itself, I think we have to redesign and rethink. And we had a forced social experiment pre-COVID, post-COVID, where we did this both in person and online, and we found that a lot of benefits, at least for certain autistic and neurodiverse individuals in the remote, because they had different channels of communication. So we summarized those in a group of ideas around how we can rethink the participatory process from the autistic lens. So one of the tactics is thinking visual over verbal, working around order as opposed to just hyperstimulation, being personal as opposed to broadly social, and also the most important part is the autistic as expert. So to give agency to autistic and neurodiverse voices to bring their expertise on how best to engage with space for them, but also for a broader population in a way that's really useful. So I'll just end with 4 very quick vignettes of these autistic perspectives, particularly at the city scale, of artists and individuals that I have worked with. So this is one set of images from one young boy, probably one of the first autistic boys I worked with, who through a photography exercise we realized was navigating and understanding bodies in space through their shadows and reflections as his own tactic that he had created to avoid the detail that people typically have or objects have. So he would follow someone's shadow, or instead of looking at the teacher, watch her shadow so he could see her movements. And that was a tactic that he evolved, and it was very interesting, and it made us think about the visual environment in a very different way. Another tactic which we operationalized in Dublin City University is what I call the sensory pathway. And it was a student who had carved for herself alternate pathways to walk around campus to avoid the main central plaza that was very loud and busy and noisy and had food and music and lots of things going on. So she had figured out little back alleys and spaces around the building. So we created an entire network and then embedded the Escapescape network on that pathway, and we've now named it after her, and we call it the Milena Pathway, and we think of it as an alternative way of thinking of how we navigate through our cities, and to always give this flexibility and opportunity for people to make it what they want. These set of photographs were shared with me by one of the artists that was showcased in our recent Venice Biennale that was at the ECC Palazzo Bambo. And when he went, his name is Stuart Nielsen, when he went to visit the show, these were photographs that he shared with me after his time in Venice, he gets very overwhelmed in cities, and he uses photography again as a tactic to understand the city. So these spiral images, he actually created another spiral on his plane ride home from Venice to Dublin, where he lives. And it helps him kind of contain the overstimulating environment of the city. He uses photography again, things like movement of the gondolas and so on, that are really beautiful. And I hope this video runs. It should. Oh, it's not. I don't know if we need to click something to run this video. This is also, while I hope it gets running, no? Okay, perfect. So this was a set of images that Stuart also created just sitting in his home in lockdown in Ireland. He had a GoPro camera out his window and documented the motion of seagulls, and what he realized after analyzing them using this computer algorithm that he had created that analyzes space and analyzes the video, is that seagulls were mirroring the pattern of the street network below, and his conclusion was because of the lockdown and the empty streets, they became this canvas of possible food or objects that the seagulls could then take for themselves and their own use. So it was very interesting that in the sky he discovered this pattern that reflected the street network, which was a really interesting example of how the autistic perspective can engage with cities in a way that's really very meaningful and interesting and something that we wouldn't have thought about. So can we go back just the final last slide, closing? I think that using these type of autistic insights, we can hopefully create these networks and infrastructures of autism-friendly cities that, again, our research is showing is beneficial for multiple groups and larger populations, not only the autistic and neurodiverse. But most importantly, I think we have done so much progress in creating these islands of accessibility, schools, spaces, offices, and so on that are accessible, but without having accessible cities, they're just islands in this sea of inaccessibility, which makes them inaccessible themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Magda. So for our last presentation before we go into our panel discussion, I'd like to welcome Professor Alan Sayegh. Alan is an associate professor in practice of architectural technology at Harvard University Graduate School of Design and the director of REAL, the Responsive Environment and Artifacts Lab at Harvard. Sayegh is an architect, designer, and educator, and the principal of Invivia, an award-winning global design firm. His courses and practice focus on technologically driven architectural design, exploring potentials of media and technology integrated built technology, interaction design, and the study of architectural and urban space through the impact of changing technology. His work is characterized as the synthesis of architecture, digital art, and design in coming up with innovative architectural human interfaces and responsive environments. Let us all welcome Professor Alan Sayegh.
Thank you for that very long intro. So, is this working? Let's see. What's happening? Loading. Something is loading. So I'm going to talk about technology, but so of course it doesn't work. Yeah, okay, so I'm not doing anything, it's doing by itself. Yeah. Okay, yeah, so my talk is about technology, but what I'm really interested is in the mind and behavior. So I'm glad I'm coming after Magda, in a sense, because although my work is about technology, but my interest is a bit broader. So my very general title is called Experience and the City. Okay, so as I was introduced, I wear two hats, which are almost two other sides of the same coin. One, I have a lab at Harvard, which is called Responsive Environments, and I have a studio, which is called Envivia. At the lab, we do more, let's say, low-level research, to understanding technologies and how technology impacts the built environment and our understanding of it. And in my studio, I do more projects. In a sense, both are experiments on different levels. Okay, so, okay, now I got it. So, my interest again is in experience, technology, and the environment. So there's this quote, fueled by rapid technological change, our neurochemistry is changing at an unprecedented rate. What's real and what's virtual is getting blurred by the day. Our brains are getting constantly rewired. Our attention, focus, values, and desires are being hacked at an alarming rate. This is a quote by me, by the way. So it's, this is what I believe in. It's not a. So there are three environments. So we have the mental environment, the virtual environment, and the physical environment. So as architects, we know how our mental, how we relate to the physical environment. We know what a brick wants to be, and we know how we understand the brick. We understand what the brick is telling us. So we know we have a good relationship with that. We really understand that. But now we're in a place where we have technology mediated in our environment, and so our workspaces, our learning spaces, everything is getting, as architects, we're not really sure what we're doing yet, because technology is really taking over in a lot of our experiences. So we're in this second phase, and then there's a third phase, which could be interesting also, is like how the environment completely talks to our, how we understand and how we perceive the space, and it's a two-way relationship. So the experiments are all the experiments that I will show are in this realm, between the second and the third. In the lab, in the lab we do a lot of experiments by almost trying to quantify our perception. How we look at the space, what are we seeing, how are we understanding it, but using technology. So almost evidence-based perception. So really, it's following a lot of the work done by the psychogeographists, and everything was being done in the 60s basically, but now we have technologies to understand how the mind is working, what are we looking at, how our gaze, where is our gaze going, and how we're, what are the correlations between how our getting stressed or not versus what we are seeing and what we're understanding. So we do a lot of experiments. Some of them go nowhere. For example, one is the effects of color on our on stress, effects of noise on stress. So there are, yeah, and we use a lot of in this case, we're using EEG sensors in the city to see if there are correlations between proxemics, if it raises our stress levels. So these are a sample of technologies. The first one is in eye tracker, so looking at the gaze, and then electrodermal activity sensor, so really looking at the stress levels correlated to the actual, almost like it's a mobile lie detector, basically, putting it in the city or in the environment to see if there are, again, to understand correlations between the built environment and our mind. So here, for example, this is in front of the GST. We took the eye tracker and took it out on the street and really understanding to see what people see, what they remember, and what they think they saw. Because if their students have walked that street for a long time and they remember things that they didn't even look at. So this again, the idea of the relationship of the mind and the gaze was important. But then really thinking about it, a lot of questions come up because what we look at, I could be looking at you, but not thinking about you. I'm thinking about my talk. So these are very dangerous kind of correlations. So but again, these are all experiments that are interesting to see if there are potentials in developing projects with them. So in this case, again, this idea of proxemics, looking at, again, stress levels, what's the baseline of a person in terms of stress, and then looking at different modes of transportation and if there are different causes of stress in proximity. So again, a very detailed analysis of different types of spaces and in terms of walking and of course we build on a lot of scientific research, so things that have been published, and then we build on that. And then the latest, we're looking at actually airports and noise levels in airports, and this is something that what Magda touched on. So this is something completely overlooked, but and there are very subtle things that can be done to make everybody's life better. So here are the different types of correlations between electrodermal activity, blood heart rate, and so I'm not going to go into the details, but you just get a sense of the. But I wanted to show this, like who are we designing for? And this is a work that I had done. Again, I'm very happy I came after Magda, but so this was about inclusive design. And but this was done for technology users and interface designers. And if it's a bell curve of people who have skills, basically, of the whole population, a designer fits they're almost like a super user. They're not on the extreme right side, but they're way beyond the top of the curve. I think this is very interesting because as architects, we don't think of it this way also. We all have our biases, and we don't have a chart like this. I couldn't find for architects or a designer something like this because it's exactly the same thing, right? But it's not as clear cut because with technology it's very easy to say, okay, you can do this, you cannot do this, but architecture is more complex, and but I think we need something like this to show that and basically what in this case what I'm showing is that the designer sits in that right side, but they are designing only for that shaded area which is right around them. So they are always designing for people like them, and so just basically going on both sides of the curve, I think, could be a very useful thing for everybody. The second part of I called it In the City, and these are projects by Vivia, and they look like this. They don't look any numbers and graphs. So they're these installations that are basically I work with technologists, artists, designers, and each one is an experiment on site with new technologies and understanding different types of behaviors. And I'm going to show a couple of them very quickly. This is a project that just finished. It's in Calgary. It's called, basically it's an underpass that both sides of the street, people walk on both sides of the street, and cars go in the middle. And it's just quite long. It's about 400 feet of walking. So people commute in the morning and at night. So there were a lot of questions, and we understood how people behave there, basically, in terms of they recognize all these people. Basically, they're familiar strangers, everybody. So that's what we called our project, Familiar Strangers. And the project became the idea of a reverse mirror, basically to see yourself how somebody else sees you. And basically, you are mirrored on the other side of your walking pattern is mirrored on the other side of the sidewalk, and vice versa. So and these are from the actual testing. So basically, your walk pulse is represented by this blobby shape, but you recognize that that's you coming from one side. And so it's again, the idea of a conversation, to create a conversation between the two sides of the sidewalk, and just to pause a little bit. So that's the whole point of the installation. And this is a permanent installation. Usually I do temporary installations. So this is a project in Minneapolis. It's called Mimi. This was a temporary installation, and the idea was to show the anxiety or the mood of the city as reflected in social media. So just basically, it's a social, it's a mood ring of a city. It's analyzing Twitter feed and looking at the levels of anxiety of this, and it changes color accordingly. So what happened is, like, people came and started dancing under it, trying to calm it down, and so it was this interesting feedback loop creating between this installation, which is completely technologically driven, and the urban place. Here it's changing color, and it's taking basically doing sentiment analysis on the text. This is another project in Harvard Yard. This is about understanding the effects of energy usage on the environment. I'm not going to go in detail about it, but this is in combination with another research that's being done. It's again always this combination between bringing the technology and the physical environment and trying to make a story out of it that can connect to our behavior. And this is similar to, this is in front of the GST when we're developing it. This was done for New York. This is in Soho. Very, very similar to Mimi. In this case, it's not as colorful like a candy, like Mimi. This is more, it's showing, because this was looking at a police feed in the city, the anxiety caused by a police feed. And so you really understand the anxiety of the city by really listening to it. Of course, children start walking on it, and but the way it's done, it creates, it resonates again, taking data from the local police feed basically, and it creates it makes a sound vibration in the concrete, which is a very thin layer of concrete. And lastly, this project, this was in Copenhagen. This is a Kulturvet Square in one of this lovely pedestrian areas in Copenhagen. And the municipality had wanted to commemorate the Armenian genocide, and this was for the centennial of it. And what we tried to do here, we said, okay, let's create a, again, temporary sculpture that collects empathy messages from everywhere. So this idea is like almost like a swirl of empathy. And so we came up with this. And it's this wooden structure that with your phone, you can look at all the messages that have been sent. So it's this combined sculpture and media. So it was the day before the opening. So I landed in Copenhagen, and I was going to actually the second in the morning. So I saw this basically, and whoever can read this, it says, Turkey is very angry at this sculpture. So it was on the main cover of the of the newspaper, national newspaper. So the ironic part, it was about empathy. The whole thing was about the country Turkey, of course. It was because of all the political reasons it opened up. But what happened is it created a debate in the parliament, and which about the recognition of the genocide, and which was completely unintended, basically. So, which something good came out of that, basically, out of this anger. Again, those are, I call them experiments, because they don't have any. Sometimes they don't have a purpose, but it's all about technology and understanding the environment, and it's about behavior also. So I'm going to end it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. And thank you so much to all of our presenters. I'd like to thank again Christian, Winifred, Magda, and Alan for this really very wonderful and amazing wide array of topics, loosely sort of categorized under architecture for the people. But I think you will all realize quickly that, yes, underlying all of our presentations indeed are questions and relationships between people and the built environment. I would like to start off with going to the very hairy question immediately. I know, like Javier had mentioned this also earlier, because I also had the same thought. I just wanted to ask all four of you, and I know, Magda, you mentioned it already in your presentation about even the title of architecture for, by, versus of, and how you said earlier that for talks about people as objects, right? Or focusing on objects. By can talk about a process, and then of can talk about agency. And I wanted to ask all of you what you thought about what should it be? Should it be architecture for, architecture by, architecture of the people? Or maybe all, or maybe none. And I'd like to pose that very controversial question immediately. What do you think? And why?
Can I just make a note on what
Sure.
I said earlier? I think I'm a big fan of hybrid positioning and not taking a binary approach of either this one or that one. So I think we need to understand first what we mean by each of them. Really, not just as a slogan, but actually on the ground what that looks like. And I think that possibly the best would be like a hybrid of finding something in between each of those positions. Because I think they're all valid and valuable.
Great.
I would completely echo that. For me, there is no. I'm all about hybrid. There's no. I don't even know where to draw the line even.
Right.
So it's absolutely need to be all. I think all of it. I feel very strongly about that.
Winifred and Christian, I'm curious.
I might throw another preposition into the mix of like architecture with.
With,
people,
yes.
Right, you know, that
yes.
that so something that I see a lot in gentrifying neighborhoods is the patina of a process, of a democratic process, and that like you have, like, oh, look, we had 3 meetings, and it's like you had 3 meetings on a weeknight with no childcare, you know, in the winter, like, you know, sort of all sorts of reasons why people maybe can't even make it to the meeting in the first place. And then at the meeting is like, here's the plan. What do you like about it? You know, and sort of like the limits of the debate around so much of these things have been set before any member of the public even makes it into the room. And so I think that's sort of part of the trickiness of kind of the for and the of, because, you know, not everyone is an architect. Not everyone has the skills to come up with their kind of alternative vision for a site. And so how do we think about all those people, even if they can't kind of make it in the room to help make the decisions, but also then we actively have to be way better about actually including the public, you know, genuinely and generatively in the process.
Mm-hmm. Great. Christian, I wonder what your thoughts were.
To me, and what I tried to say in the short talk was that somehow it's important not to superimpose preconceived visions or favorites or whatever that one brings with one to groups of people. That somehow there is, if one cares to listen and take the time, there is much more understanding, I think, in people and the condition that they're in, the socio-political condition that they're in, than one tends to give credit for, because one doesn't have maybe the time, or one has favorites or preconceived notions of what people should be thinking. And that process of discovering what we call the socio-cultural position within which we are intervening is very, very important. And one must be very careful not to impose on that.
I think, like, Christian, like what you're already saying also, which I found also very much an underlying theme in all of our presentations, was this relationship of, because as you said, you know, you're like imposing like an idea, and Winifred, you were also talking about that just a while ago. This the idea of like the embeddedness of like the political, whether it's designing with, for, by, let's say, with communities, with people, whether it's for women, whether it's for autistic people, and then also for looking at like behavior and emotions, for example, there still is that idea of the political. And by this I mean how, as you kind of also said, Christian, about kind of like the biases that we bring, right? I wonder then, because of this sort of relationship of let's say the architect, the designer, as coming in as an expert, right? There is at least an assumption that the architect, the designer, the planner is an expert, and I think the kind of the way some of the descriptions you were talking about earlier in your presentations was that then what becomes then of the role of the architect or the designer or the planner in kind of the different contexts that you're talking about, because what you've already all of you have pointed out is that I think to a certain extent what the architect, the designer, the planner is actually not doing anything good, or it's actually contributing to harm, whether it's displacing communities, you know, with gentrification, or that because as we design our cities, then it kind of neglects also autistic people, and then also necessarily the communities, you know, in Valparaiso are not necessarily sort of maybe paid attention to, right? So I wonder, how do you see the role then of the architect and the designer in ways by which then they engage with communities and with people? What do you think their role is now, or maybe in potentially also in the future?
I'll take a step. Well, I think because so many cities have abdicated their responsibilities in this respect, it has fallen to the architect and the designer to think about issues of public engagement and accessibility in a way that they didn't have to generations ago, because either cities, were pretending to, or just no one was talking about it anyway, and it didn't, that in a way it's unfair to put that responsibility onto an architect and a designer, because it's part of again, kind of the infrastructure of the city and it's part of a larger context that, of course, an individual architect or a designer doesn't have any control over. Having said that, since they are kind of pushed in that position, then, well, how do you do sort of the best you can with what you've got, right? How do you explicitly make your process as open as it can be? I think one of the problems with neoliberalism, because it has so centered the market in our decision making about urban spaces, is that it's so artificially limited what's considered possible. And so I think it really requires a lot of imagination on the parts of architects and designers to think outside the narrow box of the possible. And then ultimately, if something really is a bad, unfair project, I think you walk, again, that's a luxury not all architects and designers are going to have. But if it's not doing good work, if it's not work that you can be proud in, then maybe sometimes you walk away. And if enough designers kind of took that as practice, then maybe developers and cities would start to think differently about how they. But again, I think it's in many ways unfair to kind of put that responsibility on architects.
To think about this very complex problem, you have to think about it from every single different angle. So I think the role that more and more architects find themselves put in is not necessarily designer. A lot of times we end up not designing at all in these projects. We're engaged in them in conversations or programming or decision making, but not necessarily constructing anything in the end. And I think that could be a good thing. I think architects need to think of themselves maybe as mediators between powers like communities and policymakers or negotiators. And a lot of times, I was recently at a talk that I was introduced as an advocate. I think even in Venice, they introduced me as a design advocate. And I think that's an important thing we again, found ourselves accidentally put into to speak on, to the best of our abilities, on behalf of people. And in this kind of advocacy role, I believe in something called incremental radicalism. Like, it's important to be radical, but sometimes being radical doesn't necessarily get immediate results, but you can do small pieces of radicalism that can, in the aggregate, create change. So I think as architects, we can have conversations. I wish there were city planners here or politicians, or maybe we can disseminate this to them in asking the right questions. Like, what are you building? Why are you building it? Who are you building it for? Should you even build something at all? I think those are important roles that we need to engage in, and also identifying the programming. I think too often we as architects are engaged after those decisions have been made and the program is set as this is what we are going to build. I think the earlier we engage in that process and influence what or if something is going to be built, I think it's important. And then also, perhaps the most important thing is the kind of work that Alan is doing, which is to create and visualize and make available the data of the impact of these decisions. Because a lot of times it's because people don't know that by building this way, they're disenfranchising women or certain groups or certain people with different abilities. But when you visualize the impact that has, both the negative impact, but also what are the positive impacts in building differently? So when you do it differently, when you do include women in your spaces, what is the bottom dollar, what is the effect on the bottom line? How can it be something that people want to invest in? When you build spaces that are accessible for autistic and neurodiverse people, are people more productive in their workspaces? Are mobility networks more accessible for broader groups of people? So what is the data that policymakers and politicians can invest in, knowing that there will be a return on that investment?
Christian or Alan, would you like to comment on that? Yeah.
It, as has been already suggested, it's incredibly difficult. If you run an architectural practice and you have employees that you have to pay at the end of the month, and a certain commission is offered, it's very difficult to say no, we won't do it. because that would mean either dismissing half your office or not paying the salaries or whatever. So in that sense, it's an impossible position. It's a luxury to be in academia because you can run projects and all that and say no. But that is a totally unreal, in a way, world that most architects don't have the privilege of being part of. So it's very difficult. And as far as I know, and I've been in both practice and academia, in practice, you're placed as an architect in an impossible position.
Right. Right.
Well, I must agree with everything you said. But I'm just, I guess, as architects, we don't have a clear understanding, I feel, of our let's say power, because on one level we think we can do more than what we think we can, but on the other hand, so there's a disconnect there, I think, about how much we can influence versus how much we think we can influence. I think that's one thing I've and maybe this is not answering your question, but I think that's something that I've always thought about, and I don't know. Maybe this is a question even. Like I don't even have an answer for it. But I always think that there is a disconnect because we are in a tradition. Architects were this, like from the longest time. I mean, in Europe is a bit different than the U.S. also how architects are perceived. But we have this like in a Eurocentric. Version of the architect is a bit more like we can do a lot, we can change, we have a the cultural impact that we can do is much, we think it's much bigger, but I think there's a disconnect there. That's the thing. And of course the US is very different in as you saw, my work is not pure architecture, I do these experiments, but from my observations this is something that I think is important to think about, or as architects to contemplate a little bit.
Right, the sense of power, and and also then the sense of responsibility, right, that comes with that power, is something that then really comes from this tradition also of, the hero worship, like the architect as sort of the sole author, that comes from that same sense that somehow the architect wields this power. But as you said, but how to what extent do we really have power? Because there are also other forces, such as the influence of the developers, right? Of course, like policies are very much, and then the ideology that's dominating, as I've mentioned also about like neoliberalism. And in sense of that power and privilege, one thing that I also realized quickly is that all of us, for example, are all in academia. And what struck me also with all of your presentations was that then there seemed to be a call for a reevaluation of how, let's say, architecture is being practiced and being produced and being consumed and so on. And I suspect because we are, in fact, in a very privileged position of being in academia, like as you said, Christian, it's a luxury also to a certain extent, right? I wonder then, because you're all alluding to something that's missing, but there's also something that you're seeing that needs to be changed, and I think all of your work are trying to do that, right? So I'll shift then maybe the conversation or just the question on terms of educating then, right? In educating future architects, designers then, to be able to then maybe design an architecture for, by, with, of the people then, what do you think needs to change in the educational system? I know it's a larger sort of complex system, but each of you are actually doing something there. But I wonder, like, what do you else see that needs to change in the system to be able to design an architecture for, by, with, of the people? I'm curious.
I'll be the first victim of this question. I think within the neoliberal system, there isn't a solution, to be honest. I think we educate architects, we try to enlighten them as we see it with attitudes that hopefully would improve the system. But at the end of the day, they graduate and they have to go and get a job, and the jobs mostly are in the private sector and so on. But, and there is a but, a big but in my sense, which is the social democracy. In the Scandinavian countries from the end of the Second World War, there was a system of social democracy that gave, which doesn't exist at the moment, but it did exist for many decades, in which architects did have a real role in, for example, public housing. Public housing was quite enlightened, at least compared to what it is today, and architects played, and urban planners and so on, played a major role in how cities were developed. And there were fascinating discussions about the direction that cities should take, and they were doing projects at the same time, massive projects at the same time, that somehow reflected those discussions. And there wasn't agreement totally on it, but nonetheless, they could influence seriously the direction that cities were taking at the time. I think from 1945, at least in Norway, I would say 1945 to the discovery of oil in the North Sea, 1970, 69, 70, that was very much the case. And it was very interesting. So it is possible, I think, but it's not up to individual architects. It's much more the socio-political system that we choose to live under.
Because it is a larger system that they're part of.
Yep.
Right. Your sense, yes.
Well, one thing I think, I think the greatest compliment I've ever received on any of my work is I never thought about it that way before, right? And so I think that's part of the work that educators do, is to just get people to think differently about things. And I think something that a lot of architecture schools, I know certainly in landscape architecture programs, are starting to think about social justice in a way that they never did before. And that's becoming part of the curriculum in a way that it never would have been before. Similarly, in urban planning programs, so I'm a geographer, I generally train students who end up becoming urban planners. And so they then have this toolkit when they're like going to grad school that they never had before. So that's something that we can do. But of course then, and they may get a lot of that depending on the graduate program. They may get a very kind of social justice oriented image, and then they go and work for a private company or they work for a city, and the city's like, nope. I mean, to be fair, there's a great diversity of opinion within, for example, planning departments. But sort of what comes out is this unified vision that again may kind of, I mean, I think there has been some movement, at least in terms of the lip service given to some of these issues, and then maybe not so much on the follow-through, depending on the case. But I think there are individual examples where enough community opposition and organization sustained over time with, a quote-unquote, like sometimes I'm called in to be like the so-called expert on something. The idea being with a community group that if they don't take the community members seriously, maybe they'll take an academic seriously, when of course there's no one, urban planning departments take less seriously than an academic. But the community has great faith in academia if policymakers do not. So to be part and parcel of making that case. At the same time, I've also seen my work totally dismissed by policymakers because they're like, well, you're using the wrong data. Well, I'm using city data. So what does that say about your processes if my data is wrong? Like if they don't want to hear it, they will not hear it. And so that, I mean, and again, that gets back to the issue of the larger system that educators themselves are not going to be able to fix.
I've actually thought a lot about our responsibility as educators of this future. generation of the people that are going to make our spaces. But I think, again, one of the greatest compliments I got about one of our graduates who won an award, the jury said they had a good balance between social consciousness and technical competence, because they do, if they're just socially conscious driven, they have these abstract ideals and they go out into the real world and they can't operationalize them. So this balance, I think, is really important. As educators, we have a responsibility, yes, to bring up the social issues, but also to embed them in processes of implementation that can actually be constructed and built. And I also think that what's interesting is there's a lot that we find ourselves as educators really just responding to our students. I mean, this young generation is very much socially aware of the issues and very passionate about the problems that are in society. And we just need to curate that and create a space and a way to discuss it in a meaningful way and operationalize it in design. But in my studio, when we teach, we try and dismantle and expand two things: what architecture is. So does architecture necessarily mean building something? Sometimes it's not about constructing something. Sometimes it's about negotiating between existing conditions, and we have all sorts of different ways of how we investigate that. And also, again, this idea of who the user is, dismantling who we think the user is and expanding who the user is, that it isn't necessarily the users of a building that are impacted by it, but it's the community and the context around it. And so I think we have a responsibility to keep those conversations going, but luckily this generation of young people are really driving. If we don't drive it, they're going to move ahead on a lot of these issues themselves, which is great.
Yeah, I just want to build up on that. One thing about architecture education, perhaps is one of the educational systems that is most based on how we were taught. So we do same things like how we were taught, and then we do it again and again and again. And of course, it's a long tradition and it gets better and better, but what Magda just said now, the world is changing very rapidly. Mm-hmm. Like the climate issues, technologies, social issues driven by technology. I mean, so we really need to be very open to these changes. So it's not same as usual, basically, business as usual. So in that sense, you need to be very agile, I think, and almost learn also from the new generation. That's the thing. It's not this very top-down approach. So it needs to be much more learning from the new generation and to see how it can be constantly adapted, basically.
Right, definitely. Like the urgencies coming from the students, they're pushing these issues, and I've seen this also in many different contexts. And you're right, like, if we are not agile enough, the system, the educational system really becomes very outdated and not really be able to respond to the urgent issues that are already present, right? And so, like one of the things, Alan, that you were pointing out earlier, like that question, like who have we been designing for? That graph really shows precisely that kind of bias that our educational system have already implemented for decades and decades of not really paying attention, for example, to whom are we designing for, and now by, with, and of. I think we have time for questions from YouTube and also from the audience maybe. So, and I do have one more question to all of you before we end, but I think like we're welcome to, anybody want to ask questions from our panel?
We have questions from the YouTube channel.
Yes, please.
So, 1 second. I have it. To Winifred. In this Biennale, in your opinion, how was gender included or viewed in the activation of space and the availability of the city?
very much the focus on kind of community and care that you see exhibited in a lot of the spaces, making spaces child-friendly, for example. Like anything that's good for children is good for caregivers of children. So I think all of that sense of the communal, that sense of activating spaces that have experienced active disinvestment, and I think there's a real kind of undercurrent of care in the biennial that is really encouraging to see. And so that's not, again, so much of what we talk about as being gendered has nothing to do with, I don't essentialize any of gender identity, but is really just about how we have been in the habit of thinking, sort of who uses space when, what, who's supposed to do this and that and the other thing. So I think that kind of activation of spaces in ways that are about care and community and access can certainly be read through a gendered lens, even though if it was not necessarily meant explicitly to be gendered.
So this is for Magda. Having an autism-friendly city isn't in the near future. How can we accelerate the spread of implementation of autism-friendly element?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, sorry. So having an autism-friendly city is not in the near future. How can we accelerate the spread and implementation of autism-friendly elements?
I actually don't think that an autism-friendly city is too far in the future, because it's much easier, at least to begin to create it, than we think. But in order for it to happen quickly and accelerate that process, I think I go back to the point about showing evidence that it's useful, not only for the autistic community, but larger for either other communities that also have challenges with the cognition and perception of space. But a lot of times what I'm finding through our work is that the strategies that we use for the autism-friendly city or space or school or street are useful for populations that we didn't plan for. So one of our very first studies when we worked on soundscapes and acoustics in classrooms, the first feedback I got the very next day after we implemented the installation was from a teacher, because she said, although this was done for the autistic kids in the classroom, she hadn't realized how much background noise she was having to cope with and filter out on a daily basis, and she could now do her job so much better. She was so much more focused, although the study and the intervention was not intended for her. So if we capture more evidence about those types of benefits and get them in front of the right decision makers, we can maybe invest in our mobility infrastructures, on transportation, our streetscapes. There are things that we can do with sensory refuge. I think removing yourself from the overstimulating space is something that is not just an autistic tactic. All of us do it, all of us need it. Anyone who suffered with anxiety, Alan showed moving through an airport. I don't think anyone's comfortable moving through an airport. We all have moments of anxiety at different moments, and we're just conditioned to deal with it and move on. But if there's an infrastructure in place to allow for that sensory refuge or to mitigate that sensory overstimulation altogether or to a certain degree, I think it'll benefit so many more. And if we can just capture and measure that impact in ways that will move decisions. So probably it will have to be playing within the neoliberal structures of return on investment or increased foot traffic in a shopping mall or whatever, or productivity in a workplace, but in a way that at least you can start the conversation with the decision makers to enact the change, and then hopefully it'll spread.
One? Yep. We have,
Sir.
So this is
a question from the audience. Yes, please. Yes, let's.
Hi, I actually have a follow-up to that question about the autism audit and how, close or far do you think we are from it being more universal? You know, how there's the ADA or something like that. My mother works with that population, and so I was texting her through your presentation saying, you've got to go down the live stream and listen to this. And that was a question that she had and something that I was thinking too.
So The audit is in its beta version. So at the moment, it's a list of ideas of how we can be more autism friendly at the scale of interiors, architecture, and urban spaces. I think we need more data to start weighting those criteria, because we know just anecdotally that some things have more impact than others, and right now they're equally weighted in the audit, and we know that that's not necessarily the best way to run it. The problem with thinking of codifying all of this in something like an ADA, and my colleague Erin Friedlander is here, and her and I have been working on what we call ADA Plus, and thinking about how can we layer onto tools like the ADA to make it law, that you must include these types of things in building spaces, especially in the public realm. The problem with codifying around autism is that the spectrum is so broad. And the abilities, and you have everything from, we talk a lot about sensory avoidance, but we also have sensory seeking that's a need within the autism spectrum. So my answer to that is that I don't know necessarily we'll be able to have a code that looks like ADA, where this is what a bathroom should look like, this is what an elevator should look like, but we will have principles of you need to build in flexibility and choice. Something like mobility and wayfinding is something that we do a lot of work on. So like that sensory pathway, when you're building a city or building a shopping center, or think about what it's like to move efficiently through space in a way that's very busy and noisy, but also create alternative routes that are quieter, that are more accessible, that are slower, that are safer for women, for people who are aging, who move slowly, for mothers with children who may stop traffic in the very efficient tracks. So I think there are ways, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I think the autism-friendly audit is just a start. I would like to see it implemented, get some information back, see how it's being used, adapt it, and hopefully get it in front of decision makers that can make it policy.
Last question, and then I think we can end then,
Yeah.
right, with one more final question.
So to Alan, how do you use your role in academia to fuel the research and actually implement the projects / public installations in different places across the world?
Sorry, can you, I think it's your mask. If you
How do you use your role in academia to fuel the research and actually implement the projects, public installations in different places across the world?
Well, a lot of the, I guess, like the techniques come from academia. So it's, I don't quite understand the question. It's like, how do I do both? Is that, or how do I, or yeah. So basically, as I mentioned, one is the research at Real is more about creating knowledge and writing. Basically, we write papers. That's what we do with this. But the installations are more. I don't call it art. It falls under art, probably. Some people might call it art installations. For me, they are experiments. So they're still experiments in the city. And some of the technology and the findings and the issues that we discuss in academia are a fuel for this for these installations. But how do I use that? I guess one helps the other, because one is a real life experiment. The other one is more low-level research, meaning like it's using the basic science knowledge almost. So, and then both complement each other. That's the best I can give. Thank you.
So I would like to end this panel. And I was happy that, Winifred, you mentioned earlier ending on hope. Because even when I started with neoliberalism, it sounded so bleak that somehow we can't escape neoliberalism. But I actually see a lot of hope in all of your work. So I would like to, just to end this panel, is like, I would like to ask, as we are designing a future where maybe the architecture, our cities, become maybe more inclusive, more diverse, more equitable, and more just, as we design for, by, of, with people. What do you see as possible futures and or what do you see as potentials that we might be headed towards, whether it's related to your work or maybe in general as you see about architecture, cities, and spaces? What do you see as possibilities and future potentials?
You want us to go in order?
Sure, yes. That's fine.
The first thing that I'm very hopeful about in preparing my slides, a decade ago, I always had to preface all of this. This is what autism is. These are the diagnostic systems, and so on and so forth. And I don't have to do that anymore. And I think that's wonderful because when I come into a space, people typically understand and know what we're talking about. The other thing that I'm very hopeful about is how we've moved from that sympathy to empathy to double empathy to autistic as expert model in our work. And I'm most hopeful about the autistic individuals that I am working with that are becoming part of the process of creating their own spaces and having authorship over what the future of their spaces look like. Whether those are artists or students or architects themselves, I think it's very hopeful for me that we're starting to create these platforms where people with a neurodiverse way of looking at the world feel more comfortable and don't feel as problematized about their experience in that world, to the extent that they can then share it and hopefully become the authors and the designers of what it should look like in the future, because I don't think any of us has legitimacy to speak for that population or on their behalf and move the conversation forward without that involvement. So I'm hopeful about that.
Thank you.
I try to keep hope as a central thing in all of my work because the word that I hate most in relationship to gentrification is inevitable. Right? None of this is inevitable. It's the result of very specific choices. And so if we want to undo it, we also have to make very specific choices. So there's that. But I think one thing that the pandemic has done is show us how thoroughly cities as they are not working, right? And that it's not just a racialized experience or a class experience or gendered experience, but pretty much no one's happy with how this all went down, right? So I think there's an opening there. There's a potential to think differently about how we do work, how we do home, how we do the relationships between those things. I do not in any way think that it's guaranteed that we're going to improve what happens as a result, but I think there is a moment for those conversations now. And I think that a lot of what has emerged as a result, so a lot of the mutual aid work, for example, in cities, is a really hopeful example of how we could do community and urbanness differently. So that's what I'd like to see. And picking up on Magda's point before, that I think the generation that's coming up now, that they have been trained in these things in a way that we were not, and they're not going to put up with the same stuff, And so I think there's going to be a lot of pressure from below. Within cities and globally to just change the way things are done because it's simply not working.
We very much think that the problems that we've been speaking about are very much systemic. That if you think of individual architects and what they can do, I'm very pessimistic. And I think it's fairly little outside academia, of course. So what do? We try, if you believe that the problem is systemic, you try to create within this tiny little unit, which is called the studio, a structure which doesn't reflect in any way the structure that occurs outside. So we start from the belief that architectural design cannot be taught. It's not a it's not like science, let's say, which you can, or history or philosophy or whatever, that you can instruct someone on a tradition and through that instruction create philosophers or whatever. So what we do is we try to create the environment within which architecture can be done within the studio. And in that structure, teachers don't have any more power than the students that are part of the system. So everything is decided, and we have clients, we do buildings every semester with different groups of students, and every decision is made within the studio democratically. Either first by discussion, and then a consensus may arise after the discussion, and if a discussion does not bring about a decision, we vote on the alternatives. And all decisions in the studio are made like that. And the teachers have one vote, the same as every student in the course. So through trying to create a very democratic system in this micro scale, we hope to demonstrate to those students that maybe this would be possible at a much larger scale. So that's our take on this.
Thank you.
So what I'm hopeful,
Yes.
I think in the line of my work, by understanding what are the causes of stress and understanding the mind and what makes us like anxious and how we can make places more inclusive and designed for everybody. I think we're going to get to a place that we're going to create happy spaces. I'm going to end it at that note.
Thank you so much. Happy spaces, and on that note, I would like to thank all of our speakers, Christian Hermansen, Winifred Curran, Magda Mustafa, and Alan Sayeg. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us.
We're almost done. We're almost done. Thank you very much, everyone. Edson, thank you so much for moderating. Thank you all for being here, for coming all the way to Chicago, except for you in front. You have the easiest, right? And for joining us in this session. We will be back at 2 for coffee, 2:30 for our next panel, which is reimagining the city. So I would imagine everyone to be back over here at 2:30. Thank you again, and see you after lunch.